we'll see. I'll just give me a shot later on if you need anything.
Okay, will do. Hello, Mr. Brown.
How you doing?
Jenna, hey.
How are you?
I'm good. It's been a while, but it's good to see you.
It's good to see you too.
It's always a pleasure to be invited to do this with you.
Well, for anybody interested, this is the second time that you've been a guest on this podcast.
Yes.
And I'm going to link the first episode that we did, because you talk a lot about Grand Prairie history, your family's history, what you do for a living, how you got into that business. And so I think that'd be interesting for anybody that wants to know more about who you are when it comes to Grand Prairie history. But I want to talk to you today about something about what you do for a living today, and which is you do JFK tours down in Dallas, and we're going to talk about that. But and we had this whole thing planned before last week.
We did.
And then President Trump did something last week that made our conversation a little bit more prescient to the current.
Prescient is a good word. Relevant. Yes. Yes.
So tell us what you do with that. What is that?
Saying I do the tours is accurate, Jenna, but I'm still operating a funeral home in Gainesville.
Yes.
But I'm at a position in my older life and a position with my funeral home to where on days where Kendall calls me and says, Dad, we need to do a tour on this day, I can delegate some of my funeral director authorities to my son. Kendall has a brother, and my key employee, and I can leave and put on my JFK hat and meet people based on when Kendall has set up the appointment. And literally people come from all over the world, Jenna, to resolve that moment in history, November 22nd. So yes, if your question was, why am I doing the tours?
Well, what do you do, first of all? So on the tour, when you say tours, what does that include?
Kendall created all this in her mind 12 years ago. If you don't mind me going back to the actual genesis, I've deeply studied what happened to Kennedy and why since 1973. But as I learned, and Jenna, I set out to find people who were there that day, who were witnesses to Kennedy's murder. I've found people over the years, and I have become associated with other like-minded people like me. Let's just say people who are Kennedy researchers. So I've studied and acquired knowledge, but all these years, Jenna, that I studied November 22nd, I was never compelled to walk up to someone and say, hey, do you want to talk about November 22nd? That's not a good conversation starter.
Yeah.
As the 50th anniversary, so I just kept it to myself for my own knowledge. But Kendall grew up under this osmosis of what I was doing. So she got heavily involved. As the 50th anniversary of the Kennedy murder approached, 2013, Kendall said, we're going to do a lecture series on the 50th anniversary of Kennedy's murder. And I said, no, I don't think so, Kendall. And she kept pushing, prodding. And I finally realized, Jenna, she's smarter than I am. I finally realized if I was ever going to go public, the 50th anniversary was the time. I was 59 years old, and I was always wanting to talk to people, but my knowledge was about something that was one of the most horrible chapters in our history.
And controversial.
Very controversial, but I had all this that I would have loved to have shared with people. Okay. Kendall produced and directed a 2-night lecture series in the town I'm in now, Gainesville, which is 65 miles north of Grand Prairie. And we did this 2-night lecture series at the junior college in our town. And they had a little theater similar to your theater here, Jenna, in this building. And over 2 weeks, Kendall and I did a lecture series, and we promoted it in the local paper and on the local radio program. Now this is in the fall of 2013. If you are interested in learning anything about the actions that led to John F. Kennedy's murder, come to the college little theater and we're going to give this lecture series. Well, we did. And we looked back on it, and Kendall was smart enough to pay somebody to record the lectures.
Mm-hmm.
We looked back on it later and said, well, you know, that was what we wanted to accomplish. We exposed a lot of people to it. And from that lecture series, Jenna, Kendall came up with, Dad, I'm going to create a website about us. And I said, well, Kendall, I've heard of a website. Now that's me, Jenna. I'd heard of a website. And she said it's going to be called JFK Custom Tours. And when she was creating the website, Jenna, she already knew, I knew, 1 million people a year have to get to Dealey Plaza from all over the world. Finland, the UK, Australia, Europe, from all over the world, people descend to Dealey Plaza. But you and I are immune to that because we're right here and we don't think about it. Well, Kennedy's murder literally was a world event. It affected world history. It was beyond the boundaries of the United States. It was a world event. It altered world history. Yet his murder occurred 12 miles east of where we're sitting right now, Jenna. So you, me, and your parents grew up not that focused on it because we were right here. You understand? If you live down the street from Disney World, it's not that big a deal. Kendall created this website, but she had to keep coaxing me, Jenna, saying that, here's why we're doing this, Dad. You want to share what you know, don't you? And I said, yes. People who are planning a bucket list trip to Dallas to get to Dealey Plaza, to get to ground zero, to where history was altered by Kennedy's execution, they will go on the web. They will see our website, and some people will decide, I think I want to know what he knows.
That's a great idea.
Yes, and Jenna, see, Kendall made it in elementary terms for me. That made sense to me. And I said, that's what I've been waiting for. And now, through the website, Kendall puts me face to face with people who want to go as deep as I can take them. And that's what I do. I go into the darkest, ugliest hallways, corridors of this subject, the removal of our 35th president in a violent way. And so we're in our 11th year now, Jenna, of doing this, Kendall and me. And I jokingly tell people, maybe not that jokingly, that doing these tours saved my marriage.
Really?
Yes, because my wife, Kathy, I burned her out years ago on JFK.
Right.
Can you imagine waking up and every day your husband is saying, dear, guess what I've learned? I burned my wife out. I burned Kendall's brother, my son Blair, out years ago. I cannot talk about JFK to my wife or my son. But Kendall, I didn't burn her out. She became as immersed in it as I was. And that's the secret of our partnership. That's the secret of her creating the website. The two of us enjoy doing it together. I'm sure you can appreciate that.
yes.
If you were doing something with your parents or one of your parents, that makes it more fun for me. And we both know we can't do it without the other one.
Right.
I couldn't do the tours without what Kendall does, and she would not be able physically to do what I'm doing. So together, collaborating, we are JFK Custom Tours, and it has allowed me to meet some very interesting people. And I, in turn, learn a lot from the people that Kendall puts me face to face with.
Because you have an actual Continental that you take people around in.
Yes.
And that's an identical duplicate of the car?
It's very similar in appearance to President Kennedy's car. Did your dad talk to you about our tour we did?
Oh, yes. He talks about it frequently.
Okay. Well,
he tells me to remind you of the joke that you told, because he said that he almost fell out of the car. Because the reason I was reminded to get you back on the podcast was because Robin took my dad and some of their friends on this tour, which they'd all been talking about doing for years and years. But this past, November 20, I think it was the 23rd, y'all went, right?
That is correct.
The anniversary, he took them around on this tour, which there's a lot of people around on that tour in Continentals, right? There was a lot of Continentals down there.
What we saw that day was there's a Continental Club. When we say Continental, the early 60s Lincoln Continentals were unique in that they were the world's only 4-door convertibles.
Oh, really? I did not know that.
And President Kennedy selected the 1961 Lincoln Continental to be his car. There's a Lincoln Club, a Lincoln Continental Club. And the day we were there, your dad and me and these other fellas, we're in the middle of what we're doing, and here comes the Lincoln Car Club, and they're literally driving down through Dealey Plaza, and there might have been 30 to 40 restored early 60s Continentals, all painted differently, all the interiors all different, but all looked great. And we literally stopped what we were doing to watch them. None of them were designed to look exactly like President Kennedy's, but they're all beautiful. And I don't know any of these people. I don't know where they come from, but I do know they all live close enough to Dallas that they can all come together one day a year, and they will always do this motorcade through downtown, ending in Dealey Plaza, somewhere close to the anniversary of Kennedy's death. Maybe a day or two before, a day or two after, but on this day, they were doing it the day after Kennedy's death's anniversary, and we're doing our tour, and here they come. Okay, we watched them. Paul May recorded it on his phone, and it was quite a sight to see. They even had a motorcycle escort to get them through town. Okay, that was 11 o'clock in the morning. Well, I'm with your dad and the other guys for 6 or 7 hours. And towards the end of the day, I normally, not just for this gopher tour, but
that's the Grand Prairie Gophers.
Grand Prairie Gopher tour. I'm saying that because everybody in the group that day was a Grand Prairie Gopher. I normally save the ride in the car till last, Jenna. I want to build up to recreating Kennedy's motorcade. So we finally get in my car, which I store a mile north of downtown Dallas, and we're coming through. We reach Dealey Plaza. I'm assuming everybody knows what Dealey Plaza is. I maybe should give a better explanation. But anyway, we arrive at the scene where Kennedy's life was taken. But now it's late afternoon, and everybody's looking at their watches thinking, Robin, we got to wrap this up. It's been 6.5 hours. I said, oh, no, we're just getting started, because that's what I do. And as we come through this Lincoln Car Club, they have reassembled. I'm actually going to get to the answer you wanted. They've reassembled and they've got all their cars parked up and down Elm Street. Well, here we come. And some of these Lincoln Car Club guys, they're not Kennedy people. They're just car club people, but they all have an early 60s Continental they've restored. They see us coming. They start hollering and waving at us as we're going literally down the street where Kennedy was executed. And they're hollering, pull over, stop, come visit with us. And I'm at the wheel of the car and I holler, no, we're on our way to Parkland.
Which is the hospital that President Kennedy was taken to.
Yes.
And my dad
and Phil Bailey both just started convulsing in laughter. And they both said, stealing the word of where we are, they said, that Robin, that's epic. That you hit them with the word, no, we can't stop. We're on our way to Parkland. Now, that was a little bit morbid of me to say that, but in that moment, I needed to tell them why we're not stopping. We're
going somewhere else.
Yeah. And so your dad and Bailey in particular just thought that was good timing. So that took me 11 minutes, Jenna, to answer your question, but that's kind of typical of me.
That's why we have this studio for 3 hours today.
Yeah, I guess we're going to need it. I'm sorry.
I'll
try to shorten it up.
No, I love it. You tell good stories.
Okay.
But going back to, I'm glad your point about Dealey Plaza is a good one, because for one thing, I do forget that we have that just close by, but Dealey Plaza is literally right off of Commerce Street. It's if you go down 30, like you're going to go into downtown Dallas, it's right there by the Red Court building. It's right there by the highway.
Yes.
And it's a small little space, really, when you go down there and look at it. It's not huge.
You've been there?
Oh, yes. Well, I had a friend that lived just literally right there, just north of West End. Okay. So there came a period where I was going through there a lot to get out of Dallas.
Yes.
And every day, there are visitors to Dealey Plaza. There was not one day that I passed by that people were not there intentionally to see the grassy knoll. That's where the grassy knoll is located, and the bridge and all those things.
Yes.
So.
Yes. when I meet people.
Wait, and you said 1 million visitors a year come to there?
Yeah, that's documented.
Wow.
Today, not 30 years ago, but today, more people visit Dealey Plaza than the Alamo.
Is that really? I would not have guessed that.
Who would?
That's wow.
The interest in Kennedy's murder, the interest in learning of the events that led to Kennedy's murder, in my opinion, has grown stronger over the years, not decreased.
Well, I would imagine Alamo is more interesting for Texans specifically, but Kennedy is interesting, just like what you said, there's worldwide interest in that and has been. And the events of last week show just how much people now want to get to the bottom of it.
Yes.
And we're talking about the executive order that President Trump signed to what did he do?
He's demanding that the CIA release all JFK, RFK, and MLK documents.
Okay.
Files.
Because of demand. Because
the public has demanded it for years. No president was willing to go there. Mm-hmm. Now, do you mind if I add a little texture to what Trump did last week?
Sure, please.
When he began his first term 8 years ago, he said, we're going to release the JFK files. Well, at the time of his first administration, his CIA director was Mike Pompeo. Mm-hmm. Eventually, Pompeo resigned from the CIA to become Secretary of State. But at the beginning of Trump's first term, the CIA director was Mike Pompeo, who's a former congressman, but he's pretty much made a living out of Washington, D.C. most of his adult life, Mike Pompeo. Okay. Trump said, we're going to release those files. But he said it publicly. Privately, Pompeo comes to meet with President Trump. They have a private conversation, and then, without a lot of scrutiny, it's announced from the White House that the files will not be released at this time. So the public, you and me and whoever else would be interested, is thinking, what caused President Trump to reverse his position? There's a famous lawyer, famous judge. He's on television a lot. His name is Andrew Napolitano. If you watch Fox or any of Fox's entities, you will see occasionally Andrew Napolitano, a well-connected man, has a lot of powerful friends, and you see him on television giving commentary about political situations, legal situations. Andrew Napolitano. Napolitano is friendly with President Trump. And after Trump said we're going to release the files 8 years ago, and then he didn't, Napolitano later commented publicly about a conversation he had with President Trump. In his private conversation, he said, "What happened?" Referring to why didn't you release. And in that private conversation that later Napolitano was willing to go public with, he said to a television camera, "The president said to me, if you knew what I know, you wouldn't release the files either." So evidently Pompeo, as CIA director, somehow convinced Trump that it would not be the right thing to do at that time. Trump backed off. Well, you and I know that's not normally Trump's nature to back off.
But it has been for probably every president since that happened.
Yes.
Because this has been a conversation that has happened with every president.
Yes, but no president has ever done it.
Right. Which is interesting.
Well, a quick aside to that, to add another layer to that, Jenna. John Kennedy was the last president to take on the CIA. If you've heard of an event in the spring of '61 known as the Bay of Pigs, if you study your Kennedy history, you'll learn there was this event on Kennedy's watch, April of '61, the Bay of Pigs. I won't go into it, but in the aftermath of the Bay of Pigs, that whole event was a CIA-created event. Kennedy had inherited the build-up and the planning to what became the Bay of Pigs. Kennedy signed off on it taking place. I'm leaving a lot out so you and I can keep moving. In the aftermath, Kennedy told his closest advisors, this is in the spring of '61, the director of the CIA, Allen Dulles, has lied to me in the lead up to this moment. That will never happen again. I'm going to fire Allen Dulles, and I'm going to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter them to the winds. Kennedy said that in the spring of '61. And he started taking steps to rein in the CIA, but no American president has ever taken those steps since. Is Kennedy's threat to splinter the CIA into many pieces, is that connected to his own death in November of '63? Well, people want to know what I know about that, and that's one of the subjects we discuss when I'm doing a tour. But in fact, here we are today in real time, and our 47th president has said we're going to release these files about an event that occurred 61 years ago. Okay, obviously it must be important, or we wouldn't still be interested and they wouldn't still be secret. I don't know if you asked this question, but I'm just going to keep rolling and you stop me if you need to. This is a question that's often asked as I'm doing a tour. Robin, the files, the files, the files. When President Trump signed that executive order last week, people started inquiring to Kendall through the JFK Custom Tours website. Do y'all have a comment? Do y'all have a position? Does JFK Custom Tours have a comment about the president's executive order? And Kendall said, Dad, we need to have an official statement. So I'll paraphrase our official statement. Kendall and I long ago came to the realization, Jenna, as far as the JFK files, there's no smoking gun. There's no one document that would reveal to the world what happened and who was responsible. If that document did exist, it was destroyed long ago. People in our world, I say our, Kendall and me, Kennedy Research, there's many people in Kennedy Research, people in our world know what happened. We know who the principals were in planning Kennedy's execution. It's if someone has wanted the answer to those questions, Jenna, they could have found them. They could have found the answers years ago, just like Kendall and I did. Occasionally, when this subject comes up, the JFK, RFK, MLK files, when that conversation has come up through the years, I believe it's more of a subject to just cause a little excitement at the time.
Mm-hmm.
I don't believe, I hope I'm wrong, Jenna. I hope whatever is released will help the public get a better handle on what happened. But if you will allow me to just use a broad stroke here. Yes, the intelligence apparatus of our government did participate in Kennedy's murder. Anybody in my realm knows that. I'll use David Pecor as an example. Your dad, who is a student of history, he had studied Kennedy's assassination over the years from afar.
Mm-hmm.
The day that we finally did the tour, and I think this goes for Larry and Phil and Paul and Bill Liner, who were on the tour, I think they all had a pretty firm grasp of what happened to Kennedy and why it happened and who benefited. But they all needed to be able to connect some dots.
It's hard for people to, you're either on one side of the belief system or the other. We all know that someone assassinated the president. The question is, do you believe that the people that you trusted had a hand in it? Or do you believe it was just a crazy person that did it? And that seems to be the real grappling that people do is, and especially the boomer generation, which you're a part of, very trusting of the leaders of our country. You're a very civic minded generation. You trusted the people that led you in your local government and in the federal government. And it's very difficult for some to believe that there might have been some rogue people that thought that they needed to be in control more than others. And that's hard to understand that, because that blows up a lot of your own preconceived ideas about what you believe to be true.
Yes.
And that's very hard. But the other thing too is, I heard something, I was listening to some interviews because I couldn't possibly have researched enough to be able to sit here with you. And I can ask questions, but you know so much more than I do. But one of the interviews I was listening to, I think was Piers Morgan. He had some people on, and one of the guys on said, the question of the files is more of a litmus test for the current president. if you really push, if the people that really want to be in control, the bureaucracy, and all city governments have bureaucracies too. If you want to know where the president falls in the order of the bureaucracy, is he going to push the bureaucracy or is he going to fall in line with the bureaucracy? So I think more than anything else, the files are more of that question, because I don't know that even if there was a smoking gun, people that wouldn't want to believe it probably wouldn't. It's the same thing as the death of Christ. It's the same thing as all these things that happened throughout the course of history. You could have proof right in front of your eyes, but if you don't want to believe it's true or not true, then you're not going to. So I think that that's more what it is. But I also am fascinated by people's resistance to hearing what actually happened. It's more important for them to continue their beliefs that most people are good and they don't want power that bad. And that's an okay belief to have. It's just there's a lot of people, and especially now with the events that's happened in 2024 with our current president, that things could have gone very differently in the summer, could have ended up being the same exact thing. And there's even questions about that. We don't need to go into it in this podcast probably, but you see these things happen before your eyes and you're going to be either on one side or the other side. And I think and I think my dad probably falls into that category because we've talked about it over the years, and it's hard for him to believe that people could have done something that bad. It's hard. It is. So
I agree with everything you've just said.
mm-hmm.
I believe your dad falls into the category of Americans
Yes.
that used his mind to do some independent thinking over the years, but he didn't want to believe what he was learning.
Mm-hmm.
It's painful. It's difficult. You mentioned the baby boomer generation, Jenna, and the homes that we grew up in, the greatest generation, your grandparents,
Mm-hmm.
that generation wanted to believe their elected officials, wanted to believe Walter Cronkite on the CBS Evening News, whose mantra was he was the most trusted man in America. Our parents' generation, that's the environment we grew up in.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's where your parents and I came from. The day we finally got on the ground, Jenna, in Dealey Plaza, but of course we traveled throughout Dallas doing a number of things related to November 22nd. I believe your dad needed to be pulled farther down these corridors. I have not talked to your dad.
We're just using my dad as an example. It's not like we're trying to convince my dad of anything, but he's a good example of where people fall in line on this.
I believe everybody
Yes.
on the tour that day was in the same category. Robin, prove it.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. And
Prove
you probably
it.
come across those people all the time.
Of course.
Yes, yes.
I haven't talked to your dad since then. I hope what we did that day for between 6 and 7 hours, I hope it connected some dots.
Mm-hmm.
That's what Kendall and I do. We connect dots.
Mm-hmm.
Jenna, I've learned this from being with people on the tours. When somebody that books a tour with us, when we finally get face to face, normally with our customers are normally at a pretty advanced level of what they know
Mm-hmm.
about November 22nd. But very few people, when we're doing a tour, very few people connect November 22nd with the Vietnam War.
Mm-hmm.
You cannot discuss November 22nd without discussing Vietnam for this reason. The people who were in positions of power 60 years ago, the establishment, of 60 years ago, that's who Kennedy got crossways with. That's who Kennedy became a threat to. That's who eventually organized, gathered their resources, and removed Kennedy. And even though there was a number of things Kennedy got crossways with this cabal of industry and finance and big oil in Texas and our defense contractors, even though there's a number of things Kennedy got crossways with them over, the paramount reason he had to be removed is because he's not going to commit U.S. ground forces to a war in Southeast Asia, which was 9,000 miles away. He wasn't going to do it. People will ask me, Jenna, as I'm doing a tour, who were Kennedy's enemies? They may already know, but they want me to say it.
Mm-hmm.
The list is startling. Here are the entities and the people and the corporations that got on a collision course with JFK. U.S. Steel. Really, Robin? Yes. The Federal Reserve Bank.
Mm-hmm.
The intelligence apparatus of our country. Our defense contractors. Who are our defense contractors? The industries that make weapons for our military. Well, thank God for our defense contractors. We need those weapons to protect us against the savages of the world.
Grand Prairie was built on defense contractors.
Jenna, great point.
Mm-hmm.
Grand Prairie was less than 5,000 people when a defense contractor was built here, and you know that, but I'm so glad you brought that up. We need our defense contractors, we need our weapons, we need our military. But those people all got on a collision course with JFK, big oil producers. Now, all these entities that I'm listing, they all came to realize in the early 60s, they all had a common problem. And their problem was the President of the United States at the time. Every one of these enemies I'm listing of Kennedy's, individually you wouldn't think about it, but collectively you come to realize every one of Kennedy's enemies would and did benefit greatly from a prolonged ground war that took place 9,000 miles from here.
Mm-hmm.
That was the common denominator of all these entities that came together. You can call them a sinister alliance, you can call them a cabal, but it was industry and finance and big oil and our intelligence operators and our defense contractors. And they all, I'm going to change my position
Yes,
here,
please
Jenna,
do.
forgive me.
Do we need to move the mic?
No, but my 70-year-old spine just needed to move there.
Same.
For just a
I had to move myself.
Okay. In our discussion, and I'll only go where you want us to go, Jenna, but most people on this subject eventually want and need to know who were his enemies, how did he acquire these enemies, why were they so desperate to take the action they did. When Kennedy got to the presidency in January of 61, all of our defense contractors, including our defense contractors locally, were all bleeding money because there was no war. When Kennedy's administration arrived, January of 61, there hadn't been a war in 8 years, Korea. And Jenna, this is part of our tours and part of our discussion here today. If you are part of the permanent establishment in Washington, D.C., if you are someone who has made your livelihood, all of your adult life from Washington, D.C., mostly unelected bureaucrats, you come to realize that a lot of entities and industries in our country have a strong lobby presence in Washington. No lobby is stronger in Washington than our defense contractors. It's true today. It was true 60 years ago. But this was a part of American society that only evolved after World War II, not prior to World War II. So only in the last 70 to 80 years have these defense contractors commanded such a strong presence in Washington. Eisenhower inherited that from Truman. Kennedy inherited that environment in Washington from Eisenhower. Kennedy arrives at the presidency, and these defense contractors, when I say defense contractor, we have to think, what does that involve? Yes, the industries that make helicopters and jet fighters and jet bombers and tanks and jeeps, but each of those entities, whatever name they go by, has a board of directors. They have bankers, they have lawyers, they have stockholders. When you start bringing that into the discussion, it's a lot of people. And the lobby presence that industry maintains in Washington. For the pure of heart who will hear the podcast, Jenna, a lobby effort means you have to gain influence over elected officials to be persuaded to do what's best for you.
We have that locally. We have that everywhere. This is not just true of Washington.
It's true, Jenna.
This is where I think, I don't care if you're a PTA, you have lobbyists. They're called parents.
Oh, okay,
you know what
Jenna.
I'm saying?
Okay.
It's like, so that to me is very common. Like it's easy to see.
For you.
Yeah, exactly. But it's like, if you have a business or if you have an interest in a decision-making body, you're going to assert your influence over that because you feel like that's the best thing to do. The issue is when you're financially beholden to that thing too.
Yes.
And so then it becomes the issue with things like war or space or some of these bigger things. Like if I'm going to create a toy, I can adjust that toy to match the need for that toy. So if a toy's real popular this Christmas, I can change the toy to be popular next Christmas, which means that I can constantly, as a toy maker, generate new demand for my product by meeting the needs of what the demand is. When the product is war, or when the product is the thing that in war is the demand, and you run out of demand, but you have an entire ecosystem of people. Because I think to myself, if we were to close down the war machine, a lot of people locally would be out of a job. And that's something to think about when it comes to people relying on a certain industry to exist as a livelihood. And what so maybe that'll help people understand. People call it deep shadow, all this stuff, but really it's just people with interests that believe that their interests are more important than any other interests. And the way that they continue their ecosystem to thriving is to have something, to have a demand for their product. And what people like Kennedy said was, we no longer have a demand for your product at the moment. I'm not going to generate demand for war just so that y'all can make more money. It's different if you have someone like Hitler that's going around doing things overtly and you need that defense. But it's totally different when it's like generating the war and ending people's lives to supplant an entire industry so that people can have jobs. That's where he was like, no, I'm not doing that. And our current president is very similar to that. And, but I think that a lot of people that live in the country have a problem with it. It's different if it's for defense, if it's necessary. You have to have a country that has defense of its own, but to generate, It's just like advertising a toy. Okay, well, generating, demand for a toy is one thing. Generating demand for war is a totally different thing. We're talking about devastating nations, devastating people like that. So I don't know why it's not that difficult to see where the conflicts of interest were. But when you have something that's very, what's the word? Entitled, which a lot of bureaucracies become very entitled to the funds that they get. And then it's like, you're going to take my funds away? I don't think so. And they feel entitled to do things that are in their own interest. I don't know if that helps people see it in a different perspective. Maybe. I don't know. But that's how I see it. It's just supply and demand and entitlements to funds. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. And power. Entitlement to power. Who's going to control everything? And that's going to be a battle for the rest of our lives. I mean, forever.
It's human nature.
It is.
Jenna, you said it better than I could. You said it from a different perspective than mine. But everything you said, you're just right over the target. Thank you for adding some clarity to what I was trying to say. Your perspective is excellent. I'll just add
please
a couple of layers to that, but it was fascinating listening to you. You boiled it down to its most basic purpose.
And I will say this too. For anybody that's interested, Junior and I, who is one of the city council members, talked about the bureaucracy of city government. We were talking about term limits. And we were talking about how in Arlington, what they did, everybody thinks term limits are great, okay? But there's also, it's all cause and effect, okay? So what happens is they limit the terms of the city council people in Arlington to 2 years. Very short period of time.
I know that.
So what ends up happening is you run and you get elected, and it takes you a year to understand how city finance and all these things function, because you're doing it in 2 meetings a month. It's not like this is your full-time job. You're doing it as a civic servant. So you spend the first year doing that, then you spend the second year trying to get reelected again. So what that does is puts more power into the city employees. So it puts the power into the people that are employed for the city as opposed to people that are electing their elected officials. Because I can call my city official and be like, I elected you, and I want this pothole to be filled in front of my house. You can't call a city employee and say that, because they'll be like, don't care, click. So that's why we have elected officials, because the reason we have government in the first place is because taxpayers give money to the government. So taxpayers have to have had a voice. So what we were seeing in Arlington was the bureaucracy of the city government got stronger while the election of the taxpayer got weaker. So what happens now is, and that's just, when it comes to the federal government, it's just at a bigger level. The bureaucracy is the bureaucracy, and it's going to try to protect itself too.
Human nature.
So it's all a push and pull. But we talked about that. And really, if you just boil it down to that too, it's bureaucracy. It's bureaucratic control over what happens to taxpayer money. So from a pragmatic perspective, that's what we're talking about. Now, please elaborate on what you talk about, because it's more than just that, really. But
well, yes, but everything you're saying, Jenna, you're putting it on the local level, but the subject we're talking about is just on a larger scale. But it's all the same. Human nature is the same, no matter where you seek the power and wield the power. The human nature is the same. Here is what made John Kennedy unique in the American political structure, and this is what made him dangerous to the people around him. In the American political system, we know this, a number of American presidents have risen from poverty and obscurity to become president of the United States. We know this.
Mm-hmm.
If an American, through our history, chose to enter politics, and if that American had great potential and promised to succeed in politics, but if they started from nothing, they would eventually have to attach themselves to someone with money and influence and power to keep ascending, because political campaigns cost money.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we know this, but we don't talk about it because it's not pleasant to talk about.
True.
We want to see everything just on the surface.
True.
Okay, what made Kennedy a unique political creature is that his father was worth over $300 million. Then, I don't know what $300 million would be today, but at the time John Kennedy came home from World War II, a hero, and entered politics, his father was one of the wealthiest men in America, and his father was determined that his second son would become president of the United States. Joseph P. Kennedy being the father, and as John Kennedy entered politics, it was his father who propelled him. And on Kennedy's political track, he never needed to attach himself to any outside influences,
That's a good point.
as many politicians have to, because they come from modest beginnings. John Kennedy was a child of wealth, and his father was what propelled him on his political track. John Kennedy, one of the very few American politicians to never lose.
And he wasn't the second son you were talking about, was he?
He was the second son.
So he was always destined to be his
No.
father.
No.
Mm-hmm.
John Kennedy had an older brother, Joseph P. Kennedy Jr., and he was the chosen one. If you study Joe Kennedy Jr. and his younger brother, Jack Kennedy, 2 years apart in age, Joe was always the chosen one. He excelled in sports. He excelled in anything he attempted. Joseph P. Kennedy Jr., the future president's older brother.
And we can take a break if you want to stand up.
No,
You're okay.
as long as I can shift every once in a while.
You shift.
Joe and Rose Kennedy eventually had 9 children.
Mm-hmm.
The first was Joseph P. Kennedy Jr. The second was John Fitzgerald Kennedy, named for his mother's father, who was a famous Boston politician, John Fitzgerald. John Kennedy, the second son, was sickly as a child. He wanted to excel in sports, but he was always chasing his older brother. His older brother was healthier. He was more athletic. He was a natural-born leader. When we look at John Kennedy today, we think he had it all. But as a child, he was very sickly, and he was always aspiring to stay up with his older brother. Very few people know this, so we'll talk about it now, Jenna, because I'm assuming that's what you want me to do. Joseph P. Kennedy intended for his firstborn child, his namesake, to become president of the United States. The second son, John Kennedy, enlists in the Navy. He's out in the Pacific, and we've all heard of the PT-109 event. And John Kennedy comes home from the Pacific a war hero. The older brother, the chosen child, Joseph P. Kennedy Jr., is in the European theater of war. And when his kid brother comes home a war hero, he decides, I've got to do something great because I'm going to be president of the United States. And Joseph P. Kennedy Jr. volunteered for a very dangerous air mission over Germany in the last year of the war in Europe because he felt he had to do something to become a hero because his little brother had come home a hero.
There's some remnants of Cain and Abel in this story, isn't there?
Oh my gosh, Jenna. A biblical comparison. Excellent.
And some Abraham's sons and Jacob's sons. And anyway, sorry.
Jenna. Very good. Okay. Joseph Jr. volunteered for this very dangerous mission, and the B-24 bomber that he was co-piloting blew up over the English Channel. Never made it to its target. And now the family plans and the family trajectory have been altered greatly. And after the grieving process, the father puts all of his focus on the second son. But without that plane explosion, Jenna, history would have been different. Fortunately for Joseph Kennedy, his second son, who had been sickly as a child and a youth, has grown into a charismatic, dynamic adult.
That's an understatement.
It's an understatement.
He became very... It's quite interesting how television and all that fits together with his story. But anyway, I'm getting ahead.
Yes,
I'm getting ahead of your story.
Jenna, very good. After the death of his first son, Joseph Kennedy focused all of his attention and energies on the second son. And the second son will become president of the United States by the sheer will of the father. Okay.
Was he youngest president elected at the time?
Yes, good question. John Kennedy, youngest person ever elected at age 43. Theodore Roosevelt ascended to the presidency at age 42 because of assassination of William McKinley. But John Kennedy became the youngest American elected to the highest office. Very good, Jenna. All right. Joe Kennedy's focus is now on the younger son. He propels his son into Congress. John Kennedy is elected to the U.S. House of Representatives 3 times from the heavily Irish-American district of Boston. He's elected 3 times to Congress. In 1952, he runs for the U.S. Senate. He's elected. He's reelected in 1958. And by 1960, the old man's plans have reached a run for the presidency. If you will allow me a sidebar.
Yes.
But staying on the subject. In the early 50s, John Kennedy was very comfortable being Washington's most eligible bachelor. He enjoyed that role. But the old man knew that eventually he has to have a wife and produce a family. And we all know these things. Once again, I'm just connecting dots. I'll tell my tour people that I'm with Jenna. I'm saying things that's already in your brain, but you've forgotten them. And I'm reminding you to cue these facts that you already have in your brain back to the front of your brain. In 1952, Congressman Kennedy started dating an attractive young woman, Jacqueline Bouvier, who was a photographer for a local newspaper. They dated. He liked her enough that he took her home to Hyannisport. And when the congressman's father met Jackie, He knew she was the one.
Hmm.
He knew it before his son knew it. And once Joe Kennedy saw them together, he realized that's going to become the power couple before that even had a name. And it was Joe that pushed that. Okay. He's elected to the U.S. Senate, and soon after, Jacqueline Bouvier and John Kennedy are married, Newport, Rhode Island. Okay. He propels himself into the Senate. He's reelected to the Senate, and by 60, they make this run for the presidency. People forget, Jenna, that John Kennedy had this younger brother, 8 years younger, Robert Francis Kennedy. And Robert Francis Kennedy was always the campaign manager for every one of his older brother's campaigns. And Robert F. Kennedy vehemently guarded and protected his older brother. He was a bulldog. And staying on this side note for just another minute, Jenna, you may have to reel me back in. Kennedy representing the Democrats and Nixon representing the Republicans have this battle for the presidency in 1960. People forget it was the closest presidential election in history up until that time. Kennedy ended up with a comfortable electoral college margin, but in the raw vote count, less than 100,000 votes.
Interesting.
Nixon did not contest the election. Kennedy ascended to the presidency. And as Kennedy went into this transition period that President Trump has just gone through, in the first meetings of this transition period, where John Kennedy is going to decide who will be his cabinet members, the old man was sitting in on these meetings. He was entitled to sit in on these meetings. After all, he was the kingmaker. And in the first meeting of this transition team, the room is filled with political operatives and politically savvy people there to advise the president-elect. In the first meeting of this team, Joseph P. Kennedy said, Robert F. Kennedy will be the Attorney General of the United States. At the time, Robert F. Kennedy was 34 years old. And in that moment, these politically savvy people in this meeting started offering Joseph P. Kennedy reasons why that's not a good idea, Mr. Ambassador. There was a number of reasons why that was not a good idea.
That's right. He was an ambassador, wasn't he?
He was the ambassador to Great Britain,
That's
1938
right.
to 1940. What ruined Joseph Kennedy wanted to be president. What ruined his political career, when he's the United States ambassador in Great Britain, he's watching Hitler overrun Europe, and he made a tactical mistake. He thought, Great Britain and the United States are not ready to fight this fella. He's going to prevail. And he starts being a Nazi appeaser in his position as America's ambassador to Great Britain. But he made a horrible miscalculation. He was not anticipating Churchill rallying the British. Kennedy publicly supports appeasement with Hitler, and it ruins him. It ruins him politically, and Roosevelt recalls Joe Kennedy from London, and his political fortunes are finished. That's when his focus went to his oldest son. Okay, I digress.
That's interesting.
Okay. That's probably the first thing I've said that you didn't already know.
No, I did not know that.
In these transition meetings where Joe Kennedy said Robert F. Kennedy will be the Attorney General, and these politically savvy people are advising him, now, Mr. Ambassador, that's not a good idea. Nepotism, it will not look good politically. He's too young. And the old man listened to all the politically savvy people give their opinions, And when they all finished, he said quietly, Robert F. Kennedy will be the Attorney General of the United States. Well, he had earned the right to make sure the younger son will be a part of this cabinet. Okay, that's how Bobby Kennedy, the kid brother, became the youngest attorney general ever, serving the youngest president ever. Okay. What made John Kennedy dangerous as he ascends to the presidency is he's aware that everybody now this is in January of 61, Jenna. He's aware that everybody in Washington wants and needs a war. Because war is
Can I
good.
stop you for a second? To bring it to Grand Prairie history, during that 1960 presidential campaign, he came through Grand Prairie because he was actually not popular in Texas. Despite now we think he was popular with everyone, but he was not. So there is a famous, we talked on the phone last night, and I think there's a famous picture of him campaigning through Texas where he stops on Main Street and there's a huge crowd around him. I think people assumed that was from 1963 when he went from Fort Worth to Dallas that day but that was not. It was a campaign stop in 1960. So you were talking about 1961, but you wanted me to remind you about that last night. So
do you mind?
No, go ahead. Thank
you.
Yes. To get him into being elected took a lot more work than I think people realized because he wasn't popular.
I agree with you.
Right.
Kennedy's from the Northeast.
Right.
He's considered a liberal
at that time.
Today, we look at him as not liberal.
Right.
The first two things John Kennedy did as president was raise the defense budget and cut taxes. As a Democrat from the Northeast, today he would be looked at as a hawk. But at that time, the reason he chose Lyndon Johnson, a Texan, to be his running mate in the 60 election, he believed they had nothing in common. They didn't even like each other, had a very low tolerance for each other. But he believed Johnson would help him carry the southern states. And it worked. Addressing what you brought up, Jenna, and I'm glad you reminded me, the famous picture of JFK in Grand Prairie at the intersection of Center and Main Streets. That's September 13th, 1960. He's making a swing through Texas because Texas has far more electoral votes than any other southern state, and he's devoting considerable time to the state of Texas.
Was Texas red at that time?
Texas was blue, but here's the thing, Jenna.
Interesting.
Here's the thing. You may not have ever heard your grandparents say this, but many Texans in 1960 might have been registered as a Democrat, but they were conservative Democrats. And the transition was actually taking place in the early 60s of conservative Democrats in Texas starting to morph into Republicans.
Interesting.
Lyndon Johnson was a conservative Democrat. The most powerful Democrat in 1960 is the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Sam Rayburn. Where's Rayburn from? Bonham, Texas, 80 miles northeast of us. Rayburn is the most powerful Democrat in America as Kennedy is running for president. The second most powerful Democrat at that time is the majority leader of the U.S. Senate, Lyndon B. Johnson. To become Kennedy's running mate, Lyndon Johnson had to give up vast powers to be Kennedy's running mate. He's the majority leader of the U.S. Senate. So the two most powerful men in Washington in that election cycle, besides President Eisenhower and Vice President Nixon, is the Speaker of the House, Sam Rayburn of Bonham, and the majority leader of the U.S. Senate, Lyndon B. Johnson. And Kennedy is making a strong push through Texas. And on the day that picture was taken at Center and Main Streets, September 13th, it's less than 2 months till the election. Kennedy started out that day in San Antonio.
Hmm.
Kennedy woke up that day in San Antonio, had a breakfast and a rally there. He's not president yet, but he's flying in an airplane that his father had provided him that he nicknamed the Caroline for his newly
Oh,
born daughter.
interesting.
And he's flying around America campaigning for president in this multiple engine plane, propeller driven, that he named the Caroline. He started out September 13th in San Antonio. He's there. He had spent the night there. He flies to Fort Worth. He lands at Meacham Field on the north side of Fort Worth. He's driven to downtown Fort Worth, stops at a place called, there's a park in downtown Fort Worth. It's still there. He gives an outdoor speech. Lyndon Johnson is with him. Lady Bird Johnson is with him. They put him in a car, and this car leads a motorcade west out of Fort Worth. They stop in Arlington. He makes a few brief remarks in Arlington, but he wants to get to Grand Prairie, where the defense contractor LTV is.
Isn't that fascinating?
He wants to speak to all those defense workers at the plant in Grand Prairie, and they stop. We've all seen the picture, and he does make a speech there, Jenna. I mentioned earlier, Paul May is a 7-year-old boy in the picture standing there with his mother, Sue May. So Paul became a part of history by being a little school kid in that photograph right behind Senator Kennedy. Okay. Kennedy speaks there for a few minutes. In that photograph, if you know where to look, is local banker Lee D. Herring, local architect Marshall Warder Sr., Mayor James Weems. There's several local people in that photograph. You just have to know where to look for them. And 7-year-old Paul May. They drive Kennedy away from Center in Main. They go a few more blocks east on Main. They turn south on 14th Street at Graff Chevrolet, and they make their way over to the LTV Corporation.
It's important to remember we didn't have I-30 back then that I know of, but
it was in a very primitive form. It was the Dallas-Fort Worth Turnpike, but it was brand new. And they're literally, Jenna, good point, they're literally driving him from Fort Worth to Dallas on old US 80.
Because it's a highway.
It's a US
it
highway.
It still is.
But he wants to go speak to the defense contractors.
That's so interesting.
They morph him off of Main over to Jefferson and turn him in to a parking lot there at LTV. And there are photographs and movies. If you are immersed deeply enough in all this, Jenna, as I admittedly am, you can find on the internet old movies showing JFK's motorcade going from Center and Main Streets over to the LTV plant, and waiting there are several thousand LTV employees for Senator Kennedy. And they take a movie of him speaking to those LTV employees. He leaves there. They keep going east, and they end up in downtown Dallas. Part of the K. Bailey Hutchinson Convention Center today is an old arena that 60 years ago was known as Memorial Auditorium, but it's still there. Kennedy, that same day, September 13th, after he leaves Grand Prairie, he goes in Memorial Auditorium downtown Dallas. There's 7,000 people there, and he gives a speech to 7,000 people in downtown Dallas the same day he was in Grand Prairie. Then he's driven to Love Field. He gets back on the Caroline. See, the Caroline, he got off of it at Meacham Field in Fort Worth. While he's making all these stops, they fly the Caroline to Love Field, and it's waiting there for him. He gets on his plane at Love Field, and he has one more stop, Jenna. You're going to regret asking me to talk about this. He then flies to Texarkana and makes a speech after a parade in Texarkana, and that was either the 6th or 7th stop he made that day. But he's less than 2 weeks 2 months from the election, and he's working himself to the bone. Okay, Jenna, that was probably a 17-minute answer to your question about Robin. Let's talk about Main and Center Streets.
But it does show that he was not a stranger to this area of the state. This was something that he had already done before.
Yes.
And he does not the identical thing, but he starts in Fort Worth, same way.
Yes.
And then he goes to Dallas, same way. Not through the highway. I don't think he went through that way through Grand Prairie on the day that he was assassinated.
He flew.
He flew. That's what I thought. But again, it's just another day that he's coming to do it.
Repeated itself 3 years later.
I'm going to assume that was another campaign issue. Was the day that he was assassinated? I know he was speaking to chambers of commerce. Was it a campaign thing that he was doing?
He's running for president.
Because in 63, that would have been, the next election would have been in 64.
The day he was killed, he's 1 year from an election. There's going to be an election in November of 64. And Jenna, he's running for president, even though he is president. That's the purpose of the November of 63 trip to Texas. Now, you knew that he spent Thursday, November 21st in Fort Worth.
Oh, they were 2 different days.
He's in Fort Worth the night before he arrives in Dallas. But you knew that. You knew that he flew to Dallas from Fort Worth. Or you knew that he was in Fort Worth.
If you've ever been to Fort Worth, that there's a whole memorial for Kennedy. It's a life-size statue.
You've seen that.
Yes, and it's right in front of where they had that
he gave
meal.
An outdoor speech.
Yes, and so that's where that's from.
Jenna, I'm proud of you for knowing that. I don't know that a lot of people your generation know that, but yes, there's a very nice memorial to President Kennedy outside the hotel in downtown Fort Worth where he spent the last night of his life. How did you know about that?
Because I've been there.
Awesome.
I mean, I didn't go there specifically for that reason, but I was walking around. I was like, why is there a Kennedy? In my mind, I didn't know. And that's what sparked me to look it up.
Okay. He's in the middle of a swing through Texas. November of 63. He's got the 64 election on his mind, and he's getting a jump start on the 64 election. Once again, he's after the great number of Texas's electoral votes. This trip to Texas that led to Kennedy's death, that trip was planned for 5 months. Imagine all the logistics that go into a 5-city stop over 24 hours. He wants to be in Texas so long that it's going to require him spending the night in Texas.
Going back, back to 1960. How did Texas vote? Did they vote for him?
They voted Kennedy.
Okay.
Tying into your question, was Texas red or blue in 60? They were a very faint blue.
Interesting.
But Texas was transitioning to going from conservative Democrats to being Republicans. The day Kennedy is killed, the governor of Texas, John Connally, is riding in Kennedy's car. Well, John Connally and his wife, Nellie, were with the Kennedys on Thursday for Houston and San Antonio stops, eventually a Fort Worth stop, and on Friday they're with the Kennedys. Everywhere the Kennedys are going in Texas on this 2-day trip, the Conleys are with them.
But you were going, I interrupted your original, because you were talking about 1961 when he was electing his cabinet. So there's a lot of, seems like there was some controversy there with the election of his cabinet. or appointing.
Only that his father
was kind of in the midst
said,
of that.
My younger son is going to be the attorney general against all political advice. I was just throwing that in to give you a little more background about the power Joe Kennedy wielded.
Yes.
He chose the attorney general of the United States.
But you said this, one of the reasons, you were talking about John being dangerous.
John Kennedy became dangerous to the establishment. No, because he's wealthy. No one can own him. I mentioned earlier, Jenna, that many of our most famous politicians started in poverty.
Mm-hmm.
Richard Nixon came from poverty, Whittier, California, very poor Quaker family. Nixon rose to great power, but he started from poverty.
Mm-hmm. FDR.
FDR was wealthy.
Oh, he was.
FDR came from a wealthy family. But just as many of our presidents came from poverty, Ronald Reagan came from practically poverty. Western Illinois, Ronald Wilson Reagan. In that 60 election, Kennedy is from wealth. He's with the Democrats. Nixon is the Republican candidate. He came from very humble beginnings. Nixon, I'm not against Richard Nixon. I think he had a lot of good qualities. I think he was a peacemaker. I think Nixon has been misrepresented through history because of Watergate. But in that 60 election, you have a man that came from nothing running against a man of great wealth.
Who was also very attractive.
Yes.
And charismatic.
Yes.
Which Nixon was not.
Kennedy had a lot going for him that Nixon did not.
Mm-hmm.
But Nixon had been vice president for 8 years, and he actually had more name recognition than John Kennedy. Let me hit on this just a little more, Jenna. You stop me if you need to. No one in 1960 in Washington wants Joe Kennedy's kid to become president.
Mm-hmm.
No one. If you are in Washington, if you are a part of established Washington, whether you're Republican or Democrat, you don't want John Kennedy to become president, and here's why. No one can control him.
Mm-hmm.
He's a rebel. He has his own wealth, and nobody has gotten their clutches onto him in the lead up to that 60 election, and that makes him dangerous.
It also seems like it was kind of hard to smear him because seems like a lot of people knew he was kind of a playboy. Didn't seem to tarnish his reputation all that much.
Okay, Jenna. As he's running, no one knows that.
Oh, interesting.
Even as president, the press corps protected his liaisons.
Yeah, it's so interesting.
Today, we know these things. At the time he's president, that is not common knowledge, and he worked very hard for that to not be public knowledge.
Kind of like how the press corps protected FDR when he was in a wheelchair.
Very similar.
Yeah.
John Kennedy's female excursions were not common knowledge to the American public at the time he was alive. That all came out later. Going back to what made Kennedy a threat, what made Kennedy dangerous to this establishment around him is Kennedy knows that everybody in Washington is ready for a war again. He knows this. His attitude is, this is his attitude about war, and this is his attitude about the defense contractors. Kennedy has survived a war. Kennedy has had enough of war. And Kennedy is determined that on his watch, he will never commit American boots on the ground in a theater of war unless he believes America's national security is actually at risk. When he got to the presidency, he inherited a civil war in Vietnam. It was already going on when he got to the presidency. People don't think about that.
Because Vietnam started in 1960?
Well,
when did it start?
Okay.
And I'll tell you, this is important because veterans, even to this day, to get benefits, the start of when Vietnam, it's boots on the ground versus not boots on the ground. Okay. So if you are a boot on the ground in Vietnam during this particular time period, you get more benefits than if you were not. So the beginning of the Vietnam War is There's
Okay.
different beginnings.
Well, then, Jenna, you've taught me something.
Isn't that interesting?
Well, okay, if you will allow me,
Mhm.
now that you've told me that,
Continue. Yes, please.
the day Kennedy was killed, there's no Americans dying in Vietnam. And it's important to know that.
Yes.
Because history has distorted that. Okay. Kennedy gets to the presidency in 61 and inherits a civil war. Now, why are we involved in a civil war 9,000 miles from here? In the late 50s, the provincial government in Vietnam was France. Why? Well, we won't go into that because we need to keep moving, but France was the provincial government in Vietnam. In the 50s, there wasn't a North Vietnam, there wasn't a South Vietnam, there was Vietnam. And France is the provincial government. Now, Kennedy, as a U.S. Senator, travels to Vietnam in the mid-50s with other senators, and they're over there on a fact-finding mission. Kennedy and other senators travel to Southeast Asia, and they end up in
You
Vietnam.
want me to wrap it around that mic?
No, I just want to make sure I don't
pull on
damage it or pull
I
on
do.
it.
I've
I have
done
to
it.
watch that, Jenna. Okay, Kennedy's over there in the mid-50s, and what he learns from talking to the Vietnamese people is that the people hate the French. The Vietnamese people look at the French as interlopers. Well, they are interlopers. What are they doing in France? But they had been there since the end of World War II. It was a poor fit, and the Vietnamese people hate the French, and France isn't really that interested in being there. Kennedy later wrote, after his visit to Vietnam, Jenna, he wrote, "This is an untenable situation. France will not stay here because the Vietnamese people hate them and hate them being here." And sure enough, France pulls out of Vietnam in 1956. Filling that vacuum, communist China invades the northern part of Vietnam and establishes Hanoi as the new capital of North Vietnam. But from that moment on, North Vietnam is going to be controlled by communist China. Allen Dulles, our CIA director, famous man, World War II hero, Allen Dulles, CIA, fills the vacuum of France leaving Vietnam, and Dulles at the CIA, at the helm of the CIA, establishes a puppet government in Saigon, and Dulles names this puppet government the Republic of South Vietnam. And that Republic of South Vietnam's government's job is to hold off the communist Chinese in the north. That's their purpose, to hold off the communist. But that puppet government was created by our CIA. Kennedy inherits this situation in January of 61, and that's why he feels compelled, Kennedy, to keep sending military advisors. On Kennedy's watch, he continually sends military advisors to Saigon to assist this fledgling puppet government in their struggle with the communists. Kennedy is compelled to do that because his government created this Republic of South Vietnam. It's important to know this as far as the events that led up to November 22nd. On the day Kennedy arrived in Dallas, Texas, November of 63, no Americans are dying. These advisors that Kennedy keeps sending, these military men that are over there, in the mornings, these military men are advising the Republic of South Vietnam. In the afternoon, they're playing racquetball. They're not fighting, they're advising.
But we were in a conflict because
we are in an advisory capacity.
Exactly.
that he inherited.
Yes.
Okay. He has no intention of letting our presence over there escalate into a moment where he has to commit boots on the ground. You can find Kennedy in television interviews in the fall of 63 saying it's their war to win. You've probably seen him. It's their war to win. Okay. Beginning in January of 61 all the way through November of 63, Kennedy is feeling tremendous pressure from everybody around him, including his military advisors, to keep increasing our footprint over there. Kennedy knows why everybody's pushing. It's time to get into a war. And he's determined that that's not a good enough reason to put boots on the ground. We'll keep advising them. Okay. I'm going to keep going, Jen, until you stop me.
No, this is very good
because this
information.
leads us to
Yes,
November 22nd,
absolutely.
which is what we're trying to do. Kennedy knows who his enemies are. He doesn't know if they'll ever try to hit him, but he knows who his enemies are. And so does his brother, the Attorney General. Excuse me, Jen, I'm sorry, but I've got a nasal thing going on.
Was he very trusting of Bobby?
Yes, completely.
And was it good that he did?
Yes, because...
Well, obviously they had a common enemy because that's part of the files that were opened.
That is correct.
Recently, anyways.
That is, they're being commanded by Trump to open them. If we have time, we'll get to RFK's death because it's all connected. Kennedy knows who his enemies are. So does his brother, the Attorney General. He doesn't know if they'll ever try to hit him, but he knows what they want. They want a war. Remembering earlier when I listed who are his enemies. Most people, Jenna, don't think of U.S. Steel and the Federal Reserve Bank as Kennedy's enemies, but they were.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
How was he depicted in the media at this time? Was he pretty popular, or were they trying to sabotage his presidency?
On the day of his death, he had a 57% approval rating.
Okay.
And that approval rating told him that he's going to get reelected in 64.
Do you want me to move that light?
Only if you want me to. I mean,
okay.
No, it's not bothering me. Did I move it?
Well, it's just so close to you. I just
no, it is not bothering me.
Okay.
He believes he's going to win in 64.
But they weren't trying to actively sabotage him. I don't know that the press and the government had really started just colluding like that at the time.
That's happened in your lifetime.
That's happened in my lifetime. So that was separate.
Yes.
And he was I would imagine he was pretty, I mean, if he had 57% approval rating.
On the day of his death, he's at 57. What? That's huge.
Mm-hmm.
He believes he'll be reelected,
Mm-hmm.
but he doesn't want to take any chances. A lot of the things he wants to finish, he's going to need a second term.
And by this point, we'd already gone through the whole Martin Luther King situation also.
No.
When did that happen?
68.
68.
Dr. King and Robert F. Kennedy are both executed less than 3 months apart in 1968.
Okay.
And both of those moments are connected to November 22nd.
But didn't John F. Kennedy speak to get Martin Luther King out of jail? Or was that Robert that did that?
Robert F. Kennedy is becoming more aligned with MLK, but this is all after the president's death.
Okay. So I just had them confused.
You're familiar with Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech,
Mm-hmm.
August of 63 in the mall in Washington. After that
so
speech,
he was a figure at this time.
He was the face of Black America.
Mm-hmm.
He was, and to some great extent, he still is. What made King popular, he believed in peaceful protest.
Mm-hmm.
That was the benchmark of what he believed. But King, like John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy, became a threat to the establishment as his popularity grew. John Kennedy knows that this is in 63. He knows that everybody around him wants and needs a war. Let me go back to the defense contractors. Kennedy's attitude about the defense contractors, even though he increased their budget, he very much is a peace through strength guy.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, we want to build our military to the point to where no one will ever try us. That's his attitude, very similar to Trump. Kennedy knows that everybody around him wants to get into this Southeast Asia situation. He's determined not to. He doesn't think that's a good enough reason to put boots on the ground. He doesn't know if his enemies, Jenna, will try to hit him. But he knows who his enemies are. His attitude about the defense contractors is, let them downsize.
Sorry, my dad and all them just walked up.
A distinguished group of senior citizens. Does he see you?
Not yet.
He doesn't see you.
I don't know if they can see us in here.
I can't wait.
That's
until he sees Jenna. Okay.
So the defense contractors.
Kennedy's attitude is, let them downsize. Let them tighten their belts. Let them have a few layoffs. That's his attitude, as opposed to spilling American blood 9,000 miles from here. But that makes Kennedy a pariah. Whoa.
Here they come.
Oh, wow.
Hello, gentlemen.
Whoa. Edgar Paul May, Booth Bailey. Boy, P-Corps is associating with quite a collection. Wow. Great Americans right there, Jenna. The room has been filled with great Americans. Okay. We better get refocused.
Yes, I told you. And I told him to come.
That's awesome. His attitude is, what's taking place in South Vietnam, even though he's sending advisors, that's not a good enough reason to get into a ground war. But he knows everybody around him wants and needs a ground war that will require the building of conventional military weapons, because that's what they exist for.
Mm-hmm.
He knows that. He would rather they downsize than he starts spilling blood. Now, I'm going to tell you something that a lot of people don't know about and certainly don't connect to November 22nd. Kennedy signed an executive order on October the 11th, 6 weeks before he comes to Texas. In this executive order today, gentlemen, if people today want to research Kennedy, they can go through a FOIA request, Freedom of Information Act, and study all the documents that led us to November 22nd. Now, your grandparents couldn't do that. But today, any concerned citizen that's trying to figure out how we got to where we are can file a FOIA request and find the documents that led to November 22nd. Kennedy signed an executive order on October the 11th, and this is forgotten by most people, but for the purpose of our discussion, it's important. Kennedy's document today is known as NSAM 263. If a president signs an executive order and that executive order has to do with military involvement, it's known as an NSAM, National Security Action Memorandum. And Kennedy signs this document on October the 11th. In Kennedy's document, he is making it the policy of his administration, and thus the policy of the United States government, that we are withdrawing our military advisors from Saigon.
Interesting.
But now he's put it in black and white. And in that document, he goes on to say that within 2 years, every American will be returned from Saigon.
At the time that they did executive orders, was it to a lot of press fanfare?
Public's not even paying attention.
Okay.
Public didn't even know about his document. Walter Cronkite, CBS Evening News, didn't even report on his executive
Isn't
order.
that interesting?
There were 3 American television networks, Jenna. You knew that.
Mm-hmm.
There's no social media. There's no internet. There's no cable television. There's 3 American television networks. And the public hears only what they have to say. Your grandparents is who I'm talking about. Okay, he signs this document. Now, on the day he's saying we're bringing them home.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be their war to win or lose. And he's put it in black and white 6 weeks before he comes to Texas. Here's the importance of Kennedy's document, that document. His enemies have already organized and they've already made a plan to hit him. All these entities I brought up, they've already made their plans. The plans are in place the day Kennedy signs that document. Here's the importance of the document and the timing of him signing that document. If Kennedy's enemies, who become these conspirators, this cabal, if they had anywhere built into their plans, maybe a fail-safe moment, or maybe something will happen that they'll abort their plans. Maybe in their plans they have built in, maybe Kennedy will do something differently or change his focus and will abort our plans to hit him. If they had anywhere built into their plans an abort moment, once his enemies read his document on October the 11th, then that triggered them, that told them, well, there's no fail-safe, we're going. The importance of his document is he's just signed his own death warrant. But he didn't know that. And that's the importance of his document. Let's take what we're discussing, our subject, let's take the moment a few days beyond November 22nd, because we know what happened on the 22nd. Let's go to Tuesday, November 26th. This is the day after Kennedy's funeral. On the 26th, Kennedy's successor, Lyndon Johnson, is meeting in the Oval Office with the Joint Chiefs of Staff. These admirals and generals with Johnson on the 26th. 5 days earlier, these men were advising Kennedy, but on the 26th, they're advising Johnson. And in that meeting on the 26th, Johnson signs an executive order known today as NSAM 273. And Johnson's document overrides Kennedy's document from October the 11th.
Interesting.
And nobody today wants to talk about that. It's very uncomfortable to talk about, but it's our history, and that's what people pay me for, to talk about Johnson's document on the 26th, which overrides Kennedy's document. And in Lyndon Johnson's document is the Vietnam War. And the result of Johnson's document is that over the next 11 years, so now, Jenna, we're going to go into the 11 years of our history known as the Vietnam years. Forgive me, Jenna, I'm sorry, I just can't help it.
It's okay.
Over the next 11 years, 1964 to 1975, 7 million Americans are airlifted to Southeast Asia. This was not what Kennedy wanted. 7 million Americans are airlifted to Southeast Asia. We know more things about those years. I'm going to pick on Bell Helicopter, Fort Worth, Texas, instead of LTV, Grand Prairie, Texas, so it won't be quite as close to home. But I'm using Bell Helicopter in Fort Worth as an example of all these contractors. In November of 63, Bell Helicopter, Fort Worth, like these other contractors, was facing serious layoffs, serious downsizing. Between 1964 and 1975, Bell Helicopter, Fort Worth, Texas, produced 20,000 Huey helicopters, and they were all shipped to Southeast Asia. And in that 11-year period, Bell Helicopter had the greatest growth and the greatest profits in the history of their company.
If anybody is interested, newspapers.com has the Grand Prairie Daily News, the electronic, the digitally, and it talks a lot about this during that time. I mean, LTV and all these places are they're basically, LTV is the basis upon which Grand Prairie grows.
Absolutely.
So it's a very huge part of our history.
Tremendous.
I mean, I live in Avion Village, where that entire place was built to bring people in.
Paul May grew up in Avion
yes,
Village.
and it was built specifically for people that work for LT. So I mean, during the World War II.
Yes.
So it's not like it's a secret. And I have a question. Do you feel like, and I don't want to throw some more conspiratorial questions, but why do you think it was in Texas that this happened?
Okay.
Do you think that was like that was planned that way? I mean, we know there was a plan, obviously. That's why he was assassinated.
And there was an architect for Dallas. One man was asked to plan that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to give you his name unless you make me.
Is
Are
it
you
important?
going to demand?
Do you need me to demand? Please, I demand that you tell me his name.
Because your father has that name from our tour.
And you don't mean an architect literally. You mean the person that planned the trip.
A person planned Kennedy's execution.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
There's an Air Force general at the Pentagon 60 years ago that runs a department called Black Operations.
Mm.
The Air Force general that runs Black Operations is Ed Lansdale. In that period of time, Lansdale was a legend in Washington, Jenna. If you were invited to a cocktail party in Washington 60 years ago, 65 years ago, at that cocktail party, the conversation would probably eventually turn to this man at the Pentagon who has the power to overthrow governments.
Mm.
And that man's name was Ed Lansdale. He was a bigger-than-life figure, Jenna. There's a book about Ed Lansdale's life. The book was turned into a movie, The Quiet American. You're a historian. If you're interested, find the book, The Quiet American. But it's a thinly veiled novel on the life of Ed Lansdale.
Interesting.
Now, I mentioned earlier the CIA has a director, Allen Dulles, who is into nation building and overthrowing governments and establishing puppet governments, Allen Lansdale. In the aftermath of the Bay of Pigs, Kennedy fired Allen Dulles as CIA director. Dulles was into nation building. He was into overthrowing governments if he thought it would benefit the United States of America. But at that time, Allen Dulles was an old man in a three-piece suit smoking a pipe. He didn't murder people. He ordered the deaths of people. He ordered the overthrow of governments. And when Allen Dulles, this man in the three-piece suit, needs some of his wishes carried out with military force, it would be his protege at the Pentagon, General Ed Lansdale, who runs the Black Operations Department. It would be Lansdale's job to carry out Dulles, the CIA director's wishes, with military force.
You said he was a man with a pipe?
Allen Dulles was an older man in the early 60s. He's in a three-piece suit. He's very dignified. He smokes a pipe. He's a dignified-looking man. He looks like a banker or a lawyer.
Do you think that's like because I was thinking, when you said that, I was thinking the X-Files. There's the smoking man,
Jenna,
and he's like the orchestrator of all this.
Well,
isn't that interesting?
Maybe that person's a historian in the X-Files, and he models that after Allen Dulles. Jenna, if you want to go in any deeper, about the events that led to November 22nd. There are books about Allen Dulles and his brother, who was Dulles had a brother, John Foster Dulles, who was Eisenhower's Secretary of State. There are books about the Dulles brothers, multiple books about the Dulles brothers. But Kennedy inherited what Allen Dulles was doing at the CIA when Kennedy got to the presidency. Kennedy fired Dulles. Let me go back to 61, Jenna. After the Bay of Pigs, when Kennedy fired Dulles, he fired Dulles because Dulles had lied to him in the lead up to the Bay of Pigs, April of 61. When Kennedy told the people closest to him, I'm going to fire that old man, these people loyal to Kennedy said, Mr. President, you can't fire Allen Dulles. He's a war hero. He's a sacred cow. You can't fire him, Mr. President. And Kennedy's attitude was, yes, I can. And he fired him.
You just used another biblical reference. Sacred cows.
Jenna.
There's a lot of sacred cows in
Yes.
Washington, D.C., I think.
Well, Jenna, you're showing your theologian expertise. They're very impressive. Okay. He fires Dulles in 61. From that moment on, Dulles hates Kennedy with a passion. In the aftermath of Kennedy's murder, a blue ribbon panel of respected Americans is assembled to investigate Dulles. We know them today as the Warren Commission. The Warren Commission was controlled by Kennedy's enemies. Who are Kennedy's enemies? We've already discussed that. The second person asked to serve on this investigative body is Allen Dulles. But the public didn't make the connection that the former CIA director hates John Kennedy's guts, yet he's asked to investigate Kennedy's murder.
I think it's really important, like people that see similarities between all that stuff with the Kennedy presidency and see some of the similarities that we're going through in the last decade. They didn't have all, everybody talks about the internet being such a bad thing. We have people that'll make those connections now.
Yes,
you don't have it back then.
Correct, but you have it.
But we have it
and
now.
You know how to use it.
Yeah, well, a lot of people do.
Well, like you do.
I do, but there's people that are so into all this stuff. They would have connected that kind of thing together. But at the time, it made it a lot easier to cloud things and make it a lot more confusing.
Absolutely.
Because you didn't have to create like a paper trail that would lead you back to places.
Things were primitive enough in November of 63, Jenna, that there's not even any live television coverage of Kennedy's motorcade that day. There are occasional amateur photographers along Kennedy's motorcade route.
That's such a good point. That's why the Zapruder tape was so important.
Because that was a private citizen that recorded history.
So they didn't even send news stations?
Oh, well, okay. Let's talk about that. I mentioned a minute ago.
Oh, they didn't send a...
Well,
okay.
No, they did.
They did,
but
okay.
I need to add some fabric to what I'm saying. Even in Kennedy's day, White House reporters and photographers travel with him wherever he goes. Normal Secret Service protocol at that time was if a president, in this case Kennedy, is in a motorcade situation, the photographers traveling with Kennedy will be put in an open car immediately in front of him to record the motorcade. And that policy was followed on Thursday, November 21st in San Antonio, the first stop on his trip to Texas, and later that afternoon in Houston, his second stop. When he made stops in San Antonio and later Houston, the photographers traveling with him were put in an open car immediately in front of him. And you can find old newsreels of Kennedy in San Antonio and Houston on the 21st. That protocol was abandoned when Kennedy arrived at Love Field in Dallas on November 22nd. So, Jenna, over the years, I've learned things that are very disturbing, unsettling, but the people that pay to do a tour with me, they want to hear these things. But one of the disturbing things that I learned over the years was that several key Secret Service men were controlled by Kennedy's enemies that day. That's disturbing. Nobody wants to hear that. Nobody wants to believe that. You know, you talked earlier, Jenna, about how some people just can't go there. Some people can't go there, but you have to go there to get to why November 22nd happened.
I think people are a lot more open-minded to it
Today,
today.
your generation has become very distrusting of the voices on television. But Jenna, that distrust began with November 22nd because the public eventually realized they were being lied to about why Kennedy was murdered. Okay, yes, some key Secret Service people are owned and controlled that day by the conspirators. Now, we've already talked about who Kennedy's enemies are.
I'd also like to say, nobody thinks that they're the bad guys in the situation.
Right.
So when we say controlled, it's not like they don't think they're on the wrong side of that. They think that they're doing it for a righteous reason. Everyone thinks that they do things for righteous reasons. The ends.
Your wisdom is beyond your years.
So to say that there's like the shadowy, like evil side that thinks that they're being evil, they don't think that they're being evil.
No.
They think they're doing the right thing.
The man that carried
That's
out...
how deceiving we are.
No, Jenna, it's correct. The man who carried out Kennedy's murder, this Air Force general at the Pentagon, he thought he was a patriot.
Right.
We need this war, and there's an obstacle to us having this war, and I've just been given the orders to remove the obstacle. Ed Lansdale believed he was a patriot. Kennedy's enemies believed they're patriots.
Because we had just gotten out of the 50s, where communism was the number one enemy in the United States of America.
Cold War, Jenna. Yeah.
I just read a very interesting book called The White Pill by Michael Malice, and he talks about he's an anarchist when it comes to government, not an anarchist like physical, I want to destroy things, but he goes, but we very much overlook that in the 80s we had been in a decades of fear about in the Cold War, and they stopped it. And he goes, that happened in our lifetime. That's a very big optimistic moment in our nation's history. But at the time, communism was the threat. Yes. You had Stalin and you had, all those things worked together in World War II. That was all manifesting. Then you were talking about communist China that was coming up with Vietnam. So if you put yourself in their shoes, your job is to stop communism.
Yes. And that's Alan Dulles' job.
That's his job.
And that's Ed Lansdale. See, Lansdale is Dulles' hammer. When in the mid-50s, when Dulles at the CIA established a puppet government in Saigon, well, that described that moment required a little strong arm tactics. Well, that's Lansdale that provides that for his benefactor, Dulles. They were together in World War II. Okay, Lansdale. If you will allow me to drag you in a little deeper, Dallas was not plan A to hit Kennedy. Plan A, Lansdale, this guy at the Pentagon, Plan A is November the 2nd in Chicago. Now, I'm not going to go into that unless you insist. But the plan is to hit Kennedy on Saturday, November the 2nd in Chicago.
If you're interested in that Piers Morgan I was talking about, the most recent, they talk about Chicago and the mafia, and they talk about just that whole. So if you're interested, they talk about that a little bit on Piers Morgan.
Piers Morgan, I know he's smart guy. He has a good show.
He has a guy that he has a panel that talks about this.
Okay.
And that, because that's a whole nother discussion about all this, is just utilizing the mafia to carry out some.
Well, Jenna, Joe Kennedy.
That work in sanitation. Just kidding. That's a Tony Soprano reference.
Oh, I like that. The Sopranos. Some of Joe Kennedy's business partners were mobsters.
Mm-hmm.
So it is more connected than we even can imagine.
Mm-hmm.
The plan to hit Kennedy in Chicago on November the 2nd was aborted.
Mm.
The next plan is Monday, November 18th in Tampa. That was aborted. And then 3 days later, he starts the Texas trip.
Mm.
So the reason I'm bringing this up, the man that I'm giving credit for orchestra. Now, you understand, Lansdale is an instrument.
Mm-hmm.
The order, see, when we discuss Kennedy's murder, people want to know, where are the shooters? What are the shooters' names? Where are they? And I go through that. But what you really want to know is who put them in position, who gave the order.
Mm-hmm.
And who gave the order is these industries and entities they gave the order. Lansdale is the hammer, but Lansdale was the architect.
I think this is part of the documents that came out, is that it was known that Lee Harvey Oswald was very well known to these people before. He had a file. That's part of what the files just came out to admit. So it's not like he was just some random person that had done all this himself.
No.
No.
Now, you haven't asked me this, but let's just go ahead and
Mm-hmm.
mention Oswald. Lee Oswald did not fire a rifle on November 22nd, 1963.
Mm.
If I can prove that, would that absolve Oswald of killing Kennedy? Yes, because Kennedy was killed by rifle fire. If I can prove that, see, this was something I had to go hard on with your father. If I can prove that, would that vindicate Oswald? And the answer is yes. Oswald had nothing to do with murdering John Kennedy. But the people that I have been blaming for Kennedy's death,
Mm-hmm.
U.S. Steel, the Federal Reserve, our defense contractors, big oil in Texas, those people generally don't know how to kill someone. That's why they turned to Lansdale. But Lansdale does know how to overthrow governments. Okay. When the decision was made to hit Kennedy, and that decision was made 5 months before he came to Texas. That's what I'm saying about Lansdale, is he has time to put all this in place. But not only is Lansdale planning a hit on Kennedy, he's planning multiple scenarios. Now, I'm just telling you, you shouldn't believe me. See, I always tell people when I'm with them, Jenna, don't believe me. But if I've compelled you to look into this deeper, that's all I'm trying to do. Tell me I'm wrong, but then prove to me I'm wrong.
Can I ask you a question? Why do you think they opted to go the physical end as opposed to like the reputational end? Like, if their goal was to stop his power, why wouldn't they have tried to do it in a way that wasn't an assassination? They had to have known that was going to cause a lot of questions. Had they not figured out how to do that in the United States yet, where they could reputationally destroy some? Because they did it with Nixon.
Yes.
Yes.
But that's 10 years later.
That's 10 years later.
By the way, some of the principals in Dealey Plaza showed up 10 years later as Watergate burglars.
Oh, isn't that interesting?
If we have time, maybe we'll get into that. Okay. hitting Kennedy. All these entities that finally decide to make a move on Kennedy, even though I listed them earlier, even though the decision is made to hit Kennedy, none of those people, the boards of directors of U.S. Steel, the Federal Reserve, defense contractors, big oil, none of those people, Jenna, intend to go to jail.
Mm.
But yet they're ordering the death of an American president. And in the plan, and I'm telling you who they turned to carry this out, the Air Force General Lansdale, in the plan, a shiny object will be presented to the public that will draw the public's attention away from asking the question. The purpose of the shiny object is to get the public's attention so that the public won't say, who are Kennedy's enemies?
Mm-hmm.
And it worked.
And I don't think that the public at the time wanted to know all those details
Did
about
not
how
wanna
the
know.
government, they didn't
Right.
want to know, quote, how the sausage was made.
No,
They
you're
just
right.
wanted to know that they were safe
Yes.
and that someone was leading them and everything was, and they were going to go on about their merry way.
Yes. But in the plan, the public will be presented a shiny object, and that shiny object became Lee Oswald. To show you how good the Air Force General Lansdale was at planning this overthrow, and that's what it was. It was an overthrow of the United States government. Even though he's planning for Saturday, November the 2nd in Chicago, the first week of October, he has this shiny object, Lee Oswald, apply for a job in a warehouse in downtown Dallas that will overlook Kennedy's proposed motorcade route in November. The plan is to hit Kennedy on November the 2nd, but he's got Oswald applying for a job in a warehouse on October the 9th. That's how detailed this man Lansdale was. He's planning contingencies, even though the plan is to hit Kennedy on November the 2nd. Now, when I say I know that Oswald didn't do it and that he didn't even fire a shot that day, I'm saying that with some conviction, Jenna. You notice I'm not saying I think or I believe or I know Oswald is innocent. I know he was nowhere near that sniper's window. It took me a long time to take your dad and all the guys through that day when we're actually there looking at that window. Lansdale has a plan. He has a backup plan. He even has a third plan. And Dallas was the third plan. And that's just always amazed me ever since I learned that he actually has backup plans. Oswald. Who is Oswald? He's CIA. He's been portrayed over time as a Marine that wanted to become a communist. That's a lie. Everything we learn over time about Oswald is a lie that was created by Kennedy's enemies to make Oswald look like this deranged communist. He was not a communist. Oswald was a patriot. The day Oswald died, he was a patriot. He's not a communist. That's an image of Oswald, a myth about Oswald that was created by Kennedy's enemies to present him to the public. Here's the purpose of Oswald, of the patsy, of the shining object, Jenna. If the conspirators can convince the public that it was this lone nut, then the public will stop looking and the public will stop investigating and asking questions. It was the lone nut. Jenna.
It's so easy for people to believe that.
Public wanted to believe that.
Well, that's the whole thing, is when I go back into public doesn't want to know what public doesn't want to know.
That's right. We don't want
We want to know what makes us feel better. What makes us feel better is that there was a crazy communist.
Yes.
And like I said at the time, communism was the number one threat of
absolutely
in the United States.
And
at the
this
time.
guy was a communist. Lee Oswald was not a communist, but you have to research Oswald to learn he was not a communist. He was never a communist. He was CIA, and our government trained him and sent him to Russia to be a spy. But because he was in Russia,
this is not the first time I've heard this, by the way. The History Channel has a documentary.
Okay.
There's so many mainstream thoughts to this idea. It's not even funny. So what you're saying is not revolutionary to a lot of people.
To you.
To me, but I've seen mainstream outlets have this conversation.
That's good.
So that's
good.
I mean,
I'm glad we're catching up.
This is, I mean, these are documentaries that happened decades ago during times when it wasn't, the Kennedy thing kind of ebbs and flows with its popularity. Yeah. Sometimes it is a little bit more popular to talk about than others, like when Oliver Stone comes out with a JFK movie or something like that. But it's like, then other times it's like, nah. So the History Channel can put out a documentary that says something like this. Nobody's really paying attention. But I've seen this said before.
Excellent.
So, anywho.
Well, you have.
I have.
I hope you're not the exception to the rule. You might be, but I'm proud of you for already knowing these things, Jenna. Oswald. Once you start immersing yourself, and that's what I did many years ago, I just kept going and going and going and learning as much as I can. Oswald didn't know he was going to be the patsy. If you've seen the old newsreels of Oswald being dragged through police headquarters for 2 days, he keeps saying, if there's a camera there, I didn't kill anyone, I'm a patsy.
Mm-hmm.
Well, he was. But he didn't know he'd been set up to take the fall till he's already in police custody.
He also said, I haven't been charged with anything. They haven't even told me why I'm here.
Ooh, Jenna, yeah.
I just watched that. It was on that same Piers Morgan clip. They said that.
I need to watch Piers more.
Well, I don't watch him all the time. It was just, in order to get to this show, I just wanted to see what people are saying about stuff.
Good.
And they just happen to have that clip that you're talking about.
Excellent. Friday night when Oswald, first, to go where I'm going, I have to say, whether someone chooses to believe me or not, I'm going to keep going with what I've learned. By Friday night, November 22nd, Oswald is in police custody downtown. That night, FBI agents perform a paraffin test on Lee Oswald. He hasn't been accused of murdering the president or the police officer, J.D. Tippit, yet. He hasn't even been accused of it. But he's given a paraffin test. If you are familiar with it, good. If not, if lawmen have someone in custody and they think that person killed somebody else with a gun, they'll perform a paraffin test. In this case, on Friday, November 22nd, the authorities are looking at Oswald as potentially killing the president because the president was killed with rifle fire. Oswald was administered a paraffin test, and his face is covered with paraffin. When the paraffin dries, the FBI guys remove the paraffin, and now they have a paraffin mask. And if Lee Oswald had fired a rifle that day, there will be gunpowder in the paraffin mask. This is foolproof. There's no gunpowder in Oswald's paraffin mask. He fails the paraffin test. And one of the FBI agents that performed this test on Oswald called Washington, got the director on the phone. J. Edgar Hoover is one of the main beneficiaries of this moment. It is Hoover who will create for the public's viewing the lone nut idea. And the FBI agent in Dallas calls Washington and tells Hoover, Chief, it's not Oswald. He didn't fire a rifle. Well, paraffin test be damned. It's going to be Oswald. The public will never know about the paraffin test. And Hoover went on with his creation of the myth. What made Kennedy's murder different from a murder investigation for someone else, Kennedy's enemies controlled the aftermath.
Mm-hmm.
Their power is so vast that they're actually able to control the narrative afterwards. Kennedy's enemies in the aftermath have control of the 3 American television networks. Today, that's not that hard to believe. Once upon a time, that was hard to believe. Kennedy's enemies have control of the 3 American television networks and the major newspapers and magazines. They do. And the narrative is going to be created by Hoover, the FBI director, that it is a lone nut. There's nobody else involved. Oswald had no conspirators. It was one guy that went off the rails. Now, that's going back to what you're saying. The public wanted to embrace that, because if that's the truth, then we're heart struck, we're grieving, but we're going to move
It's a
on.
tragedy.
There's nobody else
but that's
to investigate.
Right.
Okay. And it worked. And my motivation today, what makes my hackles sit up and turn red today, why I stay motivated, is they got away with it, Jenna.
So after that, I mean, how old did you say you were 9?
Yes.
Okay. So, and maybe you're too young to remember the answer to this question. How many people in your, like, let's say in the 10 years that followed that event, how many people questioned whether it was a conspiracy, and how many didn't care? They just thought that what they told, like, was it a conspiracy question and a theory? The word conspiracy theory comes from this entire thing, just FYI.
Excellent.
So that
Jenna.
conspiracy theory is also a concoction, because if you can make people feel that they're dumb that they're crazy lunatics.
Yes.
But was there anybody at the time that questioned this? When did it start becoming a conspiracy theory?
The Warren people are organized by the conspirators to show the public that we're going to get to the bottom of this. The Warren people released a report to the public in September of '64, 9 months later, the Warren Report. And that official explanation is the one person did all this with no Confederates. The public, at some number of the public, read the report. Not every American read the report. The public heard Walter Cronkite say on the CBS Evening News, we can have confidence in this report that they got it right, that it was Oswald and Oswald alone.
Where did they release the Warren Report? Was it in newspapers?
Yes, but it was also in the form of a book.
Oh, it was in a book. Okay.
You can go in half-price books today, Jenna, and see on their shelves the Warren Report.
Okay.
You can buy it today.
So did people had to go out and actually buy this book?
That's correct.
To read it. Okay.
That's correct.
And was it a popular book?
Yes.
So people did want to know.
Yes. And as they read the Warren Report, they learn that we've investigated this. It was Oswald. He acted alone.
Case closed.
Case is closed. But Jenna, many Americans, some that I became affiliated with over the years, rejected that. Now, like you said, I'm 9 years old.
Mm.
By the time the Warren Report came out, I was 10 and a half years old. But people 10 to 12 years older than me read I didn't read the Warren Report. I'm just a punk.
Mm-hmm.
But people older than me read it, and many Americans reject it as impossible. It was shoddy. It was impossible. You've heard of the magic bullet.
Mm-hmm.
The magic bullet theory is the foundation of the Warren explanation. And if someone read the Warren Report and got to the magic bullet explanation, if you were really doing any critical thinking, you had to reject the magic bullet theory as impossible. And if you have to reject the foundational argument of the Warren people, then you're rejecting the Warren explanation that one man did this by himself.
So the Zapruder film probably threw a kink into all that.
Yes. And because of that, because Zapruder's movie is showing that the president is taking rifle fire from in front,
Mm-hmm.
and because the Warren explanation is that there's only one rifle and it's behind the president, then we can never let the public see rifle fire from in front of Kennedy striking him.
I just want to say, part of I told you about this book, The White Pill.
Yeah.
And his entire point was the bad guys didn't win. They tried to, but they didn't. They did for a little while, maybe. But when it comes to the Cold War, I mean, like Russia, and he goes back all the way to Stalin and all that other stuff. So he's talking about, in the end, the good guys won that fight. We ended
As far as the collapse of the Soviet
as far
Union.
as the collapse of all that, because he goes back to Stalin and Lenin, and then he kind of talks about Hitler a little bit, but it's really just it's about the Cold War in Russia, and he's like, eventually that stopped.
That's a good read, yeah.
And so that's his whole point of the White Pill is have optimism. The good guys don't have to always win. And what this is just showing that no matter how meticulous the planning went, there was a kink in all of it at some point in time because a lot of it was lies. So the maybe it didn't happen that next day that we found out the truth, but it's happening over time. And it's the doubt, because when you start to see a film in front of you, which I can only imagine that the Zapruder film made the lore of all of this even greater.
Yes.
So, but when you see that you're told something and then you see it for your very own eyes, that's when you're like,
well,
interesting.
I agree with you.
Mm-hmm.
If you will allow me to add more
Yes, please.
texture. The American public did not see Abraham Zapruder's movie until March of 1975. Your grandparents were not allowed to see that movie. Hoover got control of Zapruder's movie that weekend because it's too damning to the lone nut explanation.
Interesting. I think I remember that now that
Your parents were not able to see that movie till March of 75. But we all forget this. We forget the timing of all this. But it's my job to remind us. Hoover got control of Zapruder's movie. Why is Zapruder's movie so important? Why is it so damning? Going back to Kennedy arriving at Love Field that day to begin the Dallas motorcade. I told you earlier, on Thursday in San Antonio and Houston, all of the official photographers are riding right in front of him. By the time he arrives in Dallas, that cannot be allowed. And as the White House photographers traveling with Kennedy, who were with Kennedy on Thursday in San Antonio and Houston, as they deboard Air Force One at Love Field an hour before Kennedy is murdered, the Secret Service agents waiting at Love Field for Kennedy, who have all the vehicles lined up that will be his motorcade, the photographers getting off of Air Force One are told by the Secret Service, you go get in that red and white Continental Trailways bus. There's a bus, 8 vehicles behind Kennedy's car. And the photographers with Kennedy are commanded by the Secret Service at Love Field, you go get in that bus. And none of those photographers had the authority to say, no, we're not. You're going to put us in front of the president. So they all, like sheep, go get in the bus. And the purpose of that is Dealey Plaza is not going to be recorded. That means the Secret Service agents at Love Field know that moment's going to happen in Dealey Plaza, and they've been told by superiors, get them as far away from the president as possible.
How new of a technology was a handheld recorder at the time?
Well, some American families had home movie cameras.
Mm-hmm.
Abraham Zapruder walked into Dealey Plaza that day with a home movie camera.
So do you think that that was just a mistake of a detail to consider, the public having a camera? Or did they just not think it would be a problem? Or what do you think?
You're talking about a handheld.
Yes.
See, video didn't exist till the 70s and 80s.
Right, right.
But it was considered a luxury item, but some American families had home movie cameras, but more didn't have them than had them.
Mm-hmm.
Like my family didn't have one until 1967.
Mm-hmm.
But Abraham Zapruder that day walks into Dealey Plaza with his home movie camera.
And nobody stopped him, is my point.
Okay, staying on that.
Uh-huh.
Kennedy's enemies can control the official photographers,
But not just
but they
citizens.
can't control private citizens. In addition to Zapruder, 5 other private citizens showed up in Dealey Plaza that day with home movie cameras. Their names have gone away because these other private citizens didn't capture the shooting sequence as clearly as Zapruder. But the other private citizens that day were a man named Robert Hughes, another man named Charles Bronson, another man named Orville Nix, a woman named Mary Muchmore. In my world, you have to know these people.
Mm-hmm.
There's other private citizens that just showed up there with their movie cameras. There's even other people in Dealey Plaza, private citizens, with still cameras, not movie cameras, still cameras. So people were there to record the moment. Only Zapruder captured it clearly.
Which is crazy.
It's crazy.
It's one of those things.
When those shots started coming into that car, the official photographers are still over on Main Street in a bus. They're not going to get to see it.
And that he continued to film it even after he saw what he saw.
If you watch it closely,
Uh-huh.
of course, nobody's watched it as many times as I have.
I'm sure.
I'm kidding. But watch it closely, and every time his ears heard a rifle shot, the camera jiggles. But to your point, he kept filming.
He did.
That's the miracle, that he kept filming. Within 2.5 hours of that moment, Zapruder is at a photo lab at Love Field. Out by Love Field, there's a Kodak processing plant. And Zapruder's out there by 3 o'clock having his movie developed. But he's in the company of the Secret Service and the FBI. And when Zapruder saw his movie that day for the first time a little before 3:30, he's not alone. He's with some Kodak people in the FBI and the Secret Service. And the FBI man there with Zapruder in that moment, he calls Washington and tells Hoover, who is anxiously waiting, that he's just seen the man's movie. And Hoover wants to know, this is about 3:30, 3:40 that afternoon, what's in the movie? And the man at Love Field with Zapruder says, it looks to me, Chief, like the president's taking rifle fire from in front. So here's what Hoover's already in. Hoover had nothing to do with planning the hit. That's Lansdale, the Air Force general. Hoover, the FBI director's job is going to be to control the aftermath. And the aftermath, Jenna, is going to be more complicated than killing a man in the open car with rifle fire. The aftermath will be more complicated, and that's Hoover's job. And so who is that, Jenna?
I don't know.
And it's not one of the
I didn't even ask you about these curtains because I keep them open because I think it's fun to watch people watch.
No,
but like I could have closed it.
No, Jenna, let's be open. Let's be transparent. Let's be transparent. Okay, so Jenna, once Hoover learns of the movie about 3:40 that afternoon, he takes action. That film can never be shown to the public. Hoover calls a friend of his named Henry Luce Luce. Luce is a friend of Hoover's, but he's also the founder and publisher of Time Magazine and Life Magazine. Henry Luce, famous man. He and Hoover are pals. They go to the horse races together. Hoover called Luce that afternoon, told Luce about the man in Dallas that filmed the whole thing, and Hoover said to Luce, Henry, I know what's on the film. It's very disturbing. It's very traumatic. I don't think the public, Henry, has the stomach to see the movie.
Safety.
Yes. But Henry, I don't want to just swoop in and take the man's movie. That will seem un-American.
Mm-hmm.
But Henry, you're a newsman. It would be in your best interest to have the movie so that we can control who sees it and to not upset the public. Henry, I'm going to ask you to act for the sake of your country, to act for national security, and you get someone to Dallas and you buy that man's movie so that we won't upset the public.
What did we say earlier? People that they feel like they're justified and righteous.
You said it.
Yeah.
Well, you were correct.
And using safety as a pretense to
Jenna,
do things.
Yes. That's why I always enjoy being with you. You have so much wisdom for a young person. Okay. So Luce, thinking he's acting as a patriot,
Mm-hmm.
the founder of Time and Life magazine, Luce, who's in New York, and it's late afternoon, Friday in New York, Luce calls his top executive in Los Angeles, a man named Dick Stolley. And Luce in New York commands Stolley in L.A. to get to Dallas, find the man with the movie, buy the movie, and Luce's command to Stolley is, and Dick, when you find him, don't be outbid. Stolley in L.A. gets on the last flight to Dallas, gets into a hotel, starts calling all of his news people that he knows in Dallas, finds the man's name, finds out how to find the man. And Zapruder came home from the processing plant that day with his movie. Zapruder had Kodak develop his movie and make him 2 copies. So Zapruder left the Kodak plant that evening with the movie and 2 copies and took them home with him. Zapruder gets home. Once again, Zapruder that day, I've done a poor job of saying who is Zapruder. He's a 59-year-old businessman, strolled out into Dealey Plaza that day with his home movie camera and recorded history. Zapruder's office is in a building overlooking Dealey Plaza, so he had a short walk that day. Zapruder got home that evening, and his yard is full of newsmen, television men, radio men, magazine people. His yard is full of people because he's become a very important man.
Yes.
He has the movie, and nobody else does. And Zapruder orders everybody off of his property. They said, no, we need to talk to you. He said, you can talk to me tomorrow morning. Come to my office downtown. I'll talk to you tomorrow morning. Stolley from L.A. finds this out. And at 9 a.m. Saturday morning, November 23rd, Zapruder arrives at his office, which is in a building overlooking Dealey Plaza, the Dowtex building. It's the building just east of the school book building. Zapruder arrives, and his reception area is full of newsmen, magazines, newspapers, radio, television. But Stolley is there. Stolley goes up to Zapruder, introduces himself, says, I'm with Time Life. Talk to me first. So Zapruder invites Stolley into his private office. And in a very short visit, the 2 men agree that Zapruder will sell his movie, his 2 copies, and his silence to the Time Life Corporation for $150,000. And now Hoover, through his friend Luce, has control of Zapruder's movie. And Jenna, the public is never going to see that movie. Every November, Luce, Time and Life, would publish individual frames of the movie in Life magazine. You can go in antique stores today and find stacks of Life magazines, and you'll find some Life magazines from the 1960s that have individual frames of the movie, but you can't put it together by looking at a few frames. No one is ever going to be allowed to see the movie, and no one does. Until March the 5th, 1975.
75 or 65?
75. For 11 and a half years, no one sees that movie.
Oh, okay, so earlier you said 65, so you meant 75.
I'm sorry.
Okay, good. I'm glad.
I said beginning from 64 to 75 is the Vietnam War.
Yes.
But if I said 65, I misspoke.
75, okay. Because you were talking about your grandparents.
Okay.
Yes.
I'm sorry.
Yes.
The public never sees it until March the 5th, 1975. If you're still interested, I'll go on. One of the early researchers trying to get to the truth is a man named Robert Groden. Groden is alive. He's 79 years old.
Still to this day?
He's alive.
Mm-hmm.
He's 79, and he lives 20 miles south of here. Robert Groden. Groden was one of the first Americans to reject the Warren explanation in 64 and trying to solve this. Groden's gift in life is photography. Groden is in New York. He's a New York City guy. Groden read the Warren report. He rejected it as fiction. He rejected it as impossible. And he set out on his own to solve the crime, Kennedy's murder. Groden. Let's take Robert Groden from 1963 to 1968. 5 years later, Groden is working at a photo lab in Manhattan. This photo lab is located next door to the Time Life building in Manhattan. And the owner of the photo lab is Moses Weitzman. Weitzman is next door to the Time Life Company on purpose because he does a lot of work for the Time Life Corporation. And by 68, Moses Weitzman has this young employee, Robert Groden, that he knows is red hot on solving the Kennedy murder. And by 68, Robert Groden is 23 years old. In 1968, a Time Life employee walks in Moses Weitzman's photo lab, sits down with Weitzman. The Time Life guy has a briefcase with him, and he says, "Mo, I've got the Abraham Zapruder film in this briefcase. I want you to convert it from home speed 8mm to 30mm. Want you to convert this film to 30mm. Make me 5 copies. Don't tell anybody you're doing this. Here's my phone number, Mo. Call me when they're ready. And don't tell anybody, Mo, that you're doing this for us." But Weitzman is used to doing jobs for Time Life that the public's not supposed to know about. So that's not unusual. The Time Life guy leaves. Weitzman summons his young employee, Groden, and says, "Robert, this is Abraham Zapruder's home movie. Groden is trying to solve the crime without ever having seen Kennedy's murder." Weitzman says, "Robert, I'm putting you in charge of this project. Make 5 copies at 30mm speed. But, Robert, Don't make any extra copies. Wink, wink. So maybe Moe wanted Robert to solve the crime. So now Grodin's worst fears are confirmed. Kennedy is taking rifle fire from in front, but Grodin doesn't see this till 1968. Okay, now let's take Grodin from 1968 forward in time to 1975.
Mm-hmm.
By 75, Grodin is 30 years old, but he's been very careful about who he shows the movie to
Mm-hmm.
and who he talks to about it, because that would be dangerous. But by 1975, J. Edgar Hoover is dead.
Mm.
Hoover died of FBI director, one of the conspirators. Hoover died of natural causes in 1972. And after Hoover's death, things loosened up a little bit. Okay, in 1975, there's a young investigative journalist by the name of Geraldo Rivera.
Heard of him?
Even your generation, okay. In 1975, Geraldo is 32 years old, but he's been successful enough that ABC has given him a late night television show, and it's called Good Night America, and he comes on after Dick Cavett. Cavett is ABC's competition to Johnny Carson on NBC late night talk show. After Cavett goes off the air, Geraldo comes on, and his show is called Good Night America. So Geraldo's making quite a name for himself, even though he's just 32 years old. Geraldo learns in 75 there's this guy in New York that has the Zapruder movie. Well, Geraldo's never seen it. Nobody's ever seen it. Nobody's ever going to see it. But Geraldo learns there's this guy. And he goes in search of the guy, and he finds him, and it's Robert Grodin. So Geraldo finds Grodin, sits down with Grodin, and says, I'm sorry,
It's okay.
And says, what are you going to do with the movie, Robert? And Grodin says, well, when I have the proper opportunity, I'm going to show the world what happened in Dallas. And Geraldo self-servingly says, Robert, this is your chance. Come on my TV show. Let's show the world. And Grodin said, well, give me your phone number. I'll think about it, because Grodin knows that would put his life at risk. Grodin agreed to show the world the movie. He called Geraldo. He said, I'll do it with two conditions. One, you can't promote what I'm going to do ahead of time. You can't tell anybody what I'm going to do.
Right.
And on the day that we agree upon, you will send armed security guards to my apartment to escort me to your studio. And then afterwards, they will escort me back home. And Geraldo agreed to the conditions. So on March the 5th, 1975, I'm 21, Jenna, and I'm watching Geraldo because I'm not under a curfew, even though I was still living at home. Anyway, I'm watching Geraldo. Now, I was already on the case, had been for a couple of years, but I hadn't seen the movie. Geraldo comes back from a commercial break, introduces this man, Robert Grodin, to the world and says, this man knows more about John Kennedy's murder than any man alive. Robert, take it. You can watch this. You can pull up Geraldo and Robert Grodin, March the 5th, 1975, on the internet. You can watch this.
I had no idea Geraldo had anything to do with any of this.
So Robert sets up for this. There's a studio audience. Robert sets up what they're about to see. He shows the movie, and the key to this moment is 9 million people are watching Geraldo, But Jenna, remember in 75, there's no internet, there's no cable television, there's just 3 American television networks. And if your parents and I are up late and we want to watch television, we got 3 options. So even late at night, you have a large viewing audience. Because Grodin had the guts to go on Geraldo and show that movie, because there was a large audience watching that movie for the first time, the public is now enraged.
Mm.
And within days, hundreds of thousands of Americans are contacting their elected officials in Washington demanding that our government reinvestigate Dallas.
Wow.
And this happens only because Grodin had the guts to go on Geraldo. So in my world, Grodin is a heroic figure, a historic person, because he showed the world the movie 11 and a half years later. Some congressmen get together in a room, and there's no one in Washington that has the stomach to reinvestigate Dallas, but a few unlucky congressmen become the House Select Committee on Assassinations. And these congressmen know just enough to know they don't want to open this up, but the public's demanding it. The public is demanding this. That's what Grodin had hoped for.
I don't even know if there's even videos of the MLK or Bobby Kennedy assassination.
No. There are pictures of the balcony where MLK is gunned down moments later.
Interesting.
With RFK, I have neglected RFK. I've neglected a lot of people. Maybe you'll let me catch up with that. But those murders are connected to November 22nd. But staying on the House Select Committee, these congressmen, the public's demanding that they reinvestigate. The first thing these congressmen did was call Grodin in New York, and they said, come down here and show us the movie. So he does, and these congressmen immediately hire Grodin to be their technical expert.
Smart.
Now, some of these things I know because Grodin's a friend of mine. I mean, I've learned these things from him. He's published 11 books over the years. I mean, no one alive today knows more about these things than Robert Grodin, so he's still a great resource. But anyway, for 3.5 years, Grodin dragged these congressmen down this labyrinth of solving Dallas. And in January of 79, the House Select Committee on Assassination, see, they're also studying the Bobby Kennedy and MLK murders. In 1979, they released their findings to the public, and their findings were that in all likelihood, John F. Kennedy was murdered by a conspiracy. But then they go on to say, but at this time, we cannot identify the conspirators. This congressional committee, Jenna, with a limitless budget, cannot identify the conspirators. And they go on to say in their report, but we encourage the Justice Department to investigate this further. That's probably hard on your spine to be turning sideways.
It is.
Do you want me to change positions?
No. We're getting up to hour 3.
Well, you just tell me when to stop.
Well, just keep going with this because.
Well, you can stop me whenever you need
yeah.
to. We'll wrap it up.
But basically, it sounded like once they figured this out, they were going to kick the can to someone else.
That's correct.
Uh-huh.
Now, the reason they said we can't identify the conspirators is because in the middle of their 3.5-year investigation, these congressmen, they were visited by the agency. And they were threatened. These congressmen were threatened whatever you eventually tell the public, you're not going to mention us.
Mm.
And that's why they said we can't identify the conspirators. A second official investigation by their government, a different finding from the Warren report. They're saying it was a conspiracy, but we don't know who the conspirators were. Okay. In my opinion, there'll never be another official investigation after Oliver Stone's movie JFK in 91, because that movie introduced Kennedy's murder to a new generation of
Yes.
Americans.
Mm-hmm.
In the aftermath of Oliver Stone's movie, Congress established the JFK Records Act. And within the JFK Records Act was the JFK Records Review Board. And within the establishment of the JFK Records Review Board, a man named Douglas Horne appeared, and he was given complete access to all of JFK's autopsy files at the National Archives. Jenna, I don't know if I've ever mentioned to you the documentary A Coup in Camelot. C-O-U-P, A Coup in Camelot. I always recommend to my customers, watch that documentary. I told your dad and his cohorts, watch A Coup in Camelot. Maybe they have. If you will watch that documentary, it takes you deeper into the forgery of JFK's autopsy than any other documentary I've ever known of. And I highly recommend people who want to go deeper watch that documentary. In that documentary, you will meet a crime scene forensic expert, Sherry Feaster, who will explain exactly where the fatal headshot came from in Dealey Plaza that day. So, Jenna, I know I'm pushing our limits here, but once again, you knew if you opened the gate, I would just run through.
I know.
But I'll stop.
Well, I think that this is such a good, because you're going to have to come back on again, obviously.
Well, if I'm invited.
Well, yes, you will. But this is, I mean, we didn't talk much about the actual assassination, and I'm glad we didn't, because I think all this other stuff is it's stuff that nobody really talks much about. I think that a lot of people are going to be talking about it because I think it's
good. That's what I'm here for.
Yeah, and Oliver Stone, we could probably go down that whole path of Oliver Stone because he's quite interesting. He created a documentary called Ukraine on Fire, which I would highly suggest people watch.
Didn't know that.
You need to watch it because it's, he
Okay.
tends towards the
conspiratorial.
Well, he was on Bill Maher recently and he talked about JFK doing that movie.
Okay.
But then he kind of went down this pathway.
All right.
And Ukraine on Fire is very interesting.
Well, Jenna, I'm impressed that you know that. See, I'm pretty limited. I've spent all my time on one thing. And your generation is investigating 9/11.
Oh, yeah.
Like Kendall's brother, he's big into that. Well, I don't know anything about that.
Well, and that's just one more topic that if you have any opinions outside of the the accepted opinion, that makes you kind of it makes you the conspiracy theorist. But
that ugly word, the conspiracy.
Well,
theorist.
The other thing that you asked me to ask you about last night when we were talking on the phone, and we'll end it here because I think this is a good bookend. November 22nd was a Friday. And in Texas, we know what happens on Friday nights. Football games. So this has gone on and, you take that because there was wasn't it the 50-year anniversary of his death? They asked 3 football players from Grand Prairie. The news did. So take it away.
Okay. So Jenna, thank you for queuing me up. I'm sure you have a lot of Grand Prairie people that are interested in your podcast. Tying in a little Grand Prairie history with JFK, and we already have with the September 13th, 1960 appearance of JFK in Grand Prairie. Kennedy is pronounced dead at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time by surgeons at Parkland Hospital, and the world gets that news about 1:30. But by 1:30 Central Time, that's 2:30 in New York. So the public is not getting confirmation of Kennedy's death till later in the day because things traveled slower. In the history of Grand Prairie High School football, before there was a South Grand Prairie, there was just the Grand Prairie Gophers. And the Gophers, for a number of years, were always in the same district with Wichita Falls. But this is when Grand Prairie had one high school.
I should also say this is before desegregation and integration.
Okay.
Because we did have a high school. We had Dalworth.
Okay, Jenna, forgive me.
Well, I'm just, other people might think that we did have a high school, but.
I'm sorry.
No.
And the alma mater of Charlie Taylor was Dalworth High School.
Yes, they were the Dragons. Weren't they the Dragons?
Yes, Jenna. God bless
I talked to
you.
Dr. Vern Alexander.
Okay.
So that's how I know that.
Jenna, as a very small boy, the Dalworth Dragons would play their games on Saturday nights. And my dad would take me and some friends out to Dalworth on Saturday nights to watch the Dragons. I actually watched Charlie Taylor. Now, I was only 5 or 6 years old, but I actually watched Charlie Taylor play his games on Saturdays. Jenna, excellent. I totally ignored the Dalworth Dragons, but yes,
but they didn't. But it's because they didn't play on Friday nights.
Yes,
just
so
like what you're saying.
Yes, so we're in segregation times, and there's only one white high school, and it's Grand Prairie High School. And Wichita Falls and Grand Prairie were for years in the same district. Well, at that time, Grand Prairie in the early 60s, Grand Prairie might have been 40,000 people, and Wichita Falls was 60 to 70,000 people. And Grand Prairie, in order to get into the playoffs, would have to beat Wichita Falls, and they never could. Wichita Falls had a history of building championship football teams. Wichita Falls had won state football titles in the 40s and the 50s and 1961. So, in the fall of 63, Grand Prairie has a good football team, but they had suffered a loss or two early in the year. But later in the year, they found their footings under the leadership of head football coach Travis Rhodes, who was in his first year at the helm at Grand Prairie, and a very competitive quarterback named Gary Gilbreth and some other fine players. Grand Prairie did have an all-state player that year by the name of Dan Chilton. Okay, the Gophers gelled late in the year, and the last game of the year, regular season game, is scheduled against Wichita Falls, and it's going to be played in the Gopher Bowl on Friday night, November 22nd, 1963. You're being very patient with me because I know you already know these things, but we want your listeners to hear this. Okay. This game will decide the district championship. The Grand Prairie Gophers have never won a district championship, and they're going to compete against a team that has won multiple state titles. It's scheduled for that night. You might want to.
Y'all can come in. They're going to come in and listen to this. We're almost finished. He's telling us
wrapping
about
up, boys. We're
Friday
wrapping
night
up.
Football game.
It's time to go get in the car and go through Dealey Plaza.
You're standing right in front of our camera, sir.
Join us. Join us. See, Jenna, you look at these guys as just Dad's friends, but these are historic figures.
He called y'all cohorts earlier.
I
Cohorts.
did. Cohorts. But in the history of Gopher athletics, these were important men.
Yes.
So don't minimize, Jenna.
What did I say?
These men's.
I said, if y'all need to come towards the end, or else we'll get off on that. We'll talk about
now,
them.
Jenna will not allow me to talk about these men. Okay.
So the game was scheduled for
This
the
game,
22nd.
November 22nd, 1963, Wichita Falls at the Gophers. And mid-afternoon, H.H. Chambers, yes, that H.H. Chambers, gets word that the president's dead.
Mm.
And he starts contacting the Wichita Falls officials to tell them, well, we're going to postpone the game, even though it's vitally important.
Mm-hmm.
And the Wichita Falls officials say, well, everybody's already on their way.
Mm-hmm.
Guys, I know you know this, but I want Jenna's audience to know this. They're Grand Prairie Gopher
And
history.
we don't have cell phones at the time.
Jenna, there's no cell phones. So Chambers has to make a quick decision, and Chambers says, well, then we'll play. And I don't know if any of these men were at the game.
I was still in northern Wisconsin.
I thought you had already moved. Okay, Boog Bailey's there. I can't believe that Sue May was not there. I cannot believe it. Okay, so Boog Bailey and I are sitting there as kids.
Were there a lot of people in the audience or in the crowd?
There's not an empty seat, but half of Wichita Falls came see, so it's a big crowd.
Mm-hmm.
But at that time, the Gopher Bowl only held like 8,500. The Gopher Bowl was enlarged after that game.
Oh.
Because there weren't enough seats.
Interesting.
8,500 people attended. Now, Boog, I don't know if you remember, but there's a moment of silence for the president. And I can remember that moment of silence. Well, the Gophers won. And that had never happened. Not only had they never won a district title at the 4A level, they had never beaten the Coyotes.
Mm.
And so that night was historic locally because the Gophers won their first district title at the 4A level, which was the highest level. And the next day, there was a local newspaper called the News Texan.
Mm-hmm.
And on the front page was the story on the president's death. And on the inside was the Gophers had beaten Wichita Falls. And I found that newspaper a few years ago, and I framed it so that the glass is on both sides so that you can read about the president. And on the back, you can read about the Gophers.
I think that was a pivotal moment for you.
Are you getting that feeling?
Yes.
Well,
because you have interest in Texas, in the assassination, and also football for Grand Prairie High School.
In Gopher history,
Huh?
that was.
Yeah, Gary Gilbreth. I remember that news article because 50 years later they came back and interviewed him and two other guys.
Okay. Jenna's had trouble keeping me on subject today, guys.
I don't think so. You've done a great job.
But Jenna, in fact, you saw this 11 years ago.
I remember seeing it.
On Thursday night, November 21st, 2013, Channel 8 News, I think the reporter was Brett Shipp. He finds 3 67-year-old former Gophers who played in that game against Wichita Falls. And he has them recount their memories from that night.
Mm-hmm.
So the public that night saw a 67-year-old Dan Chilton, Gary Gilbreth, and Mark Babina recount their memories from that night.
Mm-hmm.
To show you how deeply Kendall and I are into all this, Kendall booked rooms at the downtown Hilton on November 21st, 2013, that served as the Kennedy Suite 50 years earlier. So 50 years later, Kendall and I and my wife and another relative stayed in rooms that had been the Kennedy Suite 50 years earlier. And we actually watched Chilton and Babina and Gilbreth from our hotel room in the same spot where the Kennedys spent the night that night. Anyway, did you guys watch that?
Yeah.
Wasn't that cool?
It was very interesting.
And then last night, Dave, the young historian here, tells me that she knew Gary Gilbreth.
Oh, yeah. He was the Gilbreths. Well, his wife was my kindergarten teacher, and then she taught with my mother. So, yeah. And then I grew up with the Gilbreths. When
we go off the air today, I'm going to show you a picture of 17-year-old Gary Gilbreth in that yearbook, but we'll wait and do that when we go off.
Well, that's a good
air.
ending because now I'm excited. And sorry, people, y'all don't get to see it.
And
just kidding.
you will invite
maybe I'll insert it into if you show it to me, I'll put it into now that we have video feed,
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So, guys, she's already assured me that she will invite me back. I didn't burn her out today. So, Jenna, if you invite me back, maybe we can get into the real history of the Gophers in the 1970s next time.
Hey, that sounds like a good idea. Thank you,
Thank
Robin.
Jenna, thank you. It's always great.
I appreciate it.
You're
All
a
right.
great American.
I'm going to go stop this.
So,
3 hours, Robin.
you threatened me. You said we might go over.
I told him to keep it for 1 more hour because I knew.
So, guys,